Chapter 281. The girls of Bayou Brothel did not do embroidery. They were in the business of embroidering needles. As the saying goes, if you are skilled enough, you can grind an iron rod into a needle. Today, they had come in disguise to relax. So Fan Xian and his group had changed into a normal carriage. With a clatter, they came to a secluded area in the west of the city and stopped in front of a 3-story wooden building. A worker from the building had long since come out to rein the horses. His movements were very nimble. There was also a clean-dressed receptionist who welcomed them in. Today, Fan Xian had done something to his eyebrows and added a few pockmarks to his left cheek, mirroring Fan Xi's appearance. He had cleverly darkened his appearance. In a society where information was not as advanced, he believed that not many people would be able to guess that he was the famous Fan Xian of the capital. Bayou Brothel was a wooden building. Normally, when a wooden building had 3 stories or more, the space between the floors would be compressed to ensure the stability of the building. But this Bayou Brothel was very tall. Standing in front of the building, one could clearly see the sky behind the building. Fan Xian knew that the wood of this building had to have been transported from the north. He walked into the building, and his hand unconsciously brushed over the large pillar next to the door to confirm his suspicions. It was still early, but the hall on the first floor was already filled with many guests. There was a small platform in front of them, and on it was a plainly dressed girl. She was playing a guqin, and the sound of the guqin was enough to calm one's heart. Fan Xian squinted his eyes, and he felt that this brothel was not as simple as it seemed. The 3 of them followed the receptionist's directions to the second floor. They chose a table at the back of the building and sat down. Fan Xian sat next to the railing and used his eyes to signal Deng Ziyu and Shi Chanli to sit down. Leaning against the railing, he looked down and noticed that the railing had been painted with green and gold paint. He couldn't help but think that this was a newly opened brothel. Even the details were so luxurious, and it seemed that the owner was rich. It seemed that Mu Tai's judgment had been correct, and it had to have something to do with the princes. There was something strange about this Bayou Brothel, and this strangeness came from its elegance. It did not fit the mold of a brothel. There was no pimp welcoming them, no madam putting on makeup to coax them, and not even a few voluptuous women with their breasts exposed could be seen. There was a refreshing smell, and it didn't look like a brothel at all. Fan Xian had been in the capital for a year and a half, and had been to such places a few times, but this was the first time he had seen such a scene. When he leaned against the railing and looked out, his heart jumped. The building faced the street and was secluded. Behind the building was a lake. The lake was long and narrow. It was the famous thin lake in the capital. The few of them sat by the railing, feeling the cool autumn breeze gently blowing over the lake. It was an indescribable feeling of comfort. Fan Xian could not help but pat the railing and squint his eyes. Behind the Bayou Brothel, there were many small, independent courtyards. They were hidden among the autumn trees, and occasionally the walls were white and gray. It was very elegant, but his eyes were very sharp. He had already noticed the sewage drain behind one of the courtyards. It was faintly dyed red, and he knew that there were many girls living there. It looked like the front of the Bayou Brothel was just a restaurant to welcome customers. It was like visiting a famous mountain. There needed to be fog in front of the mountain in order to arouse the curiosity of the tourists. The 3-story wooden building of the Bayou Brothel was like the fog in front of a famous mountain. It hid the small courtyards behind it, and it was the best way to arouse the desire of the customers. The owner of this brothel was very smart. If he was someone who could be bought and did not have the lives of the prostitutes on his hands, Fan Xian might have been interested in hiring him to manage the palace treasury. But when it came to the business of a brothel, Fan Xian had a very pure attitude. A customer was a customer, and a prostitute was a prostitute. One gave money, and the other gave flesh. Even if the streaky pork was wrapped in 300 poems, it would not be able to erase the essence of the business. He only took a few glances at the courtyard by the lake and could not help but shake his head. This soft Saber Mountain manor most likely earned a lot of money in a day. There was another thought that was somewhat dreary. He always seemed to be thinking, under the soil of those elegant courtyards, were there the skeletons of some weak women? While he was lost in thought, Shi Chanli had already ordered a few dishes. The service of the Balua brothel was excellent. Not long after, two servants, who looked 13 or 14 years old, came over with plates of food. They gently placed the delicate porcelain plates on the table without making a sound. They were indeed well trained. The dishes on the plates were very tempting. A dish of camellia shrimp gave off a light fragrance, and a few yellow and translucent oil quietly floated on a small bowl of chicken soup with shredded noodles. There was also a home-style beef soaked in oil with shredded green onions 3 fingers wide. There were also a few small dishes that went well with the wine. The handsome servants poured wine for the 3 of them, and Sir Chandley waved his hand to dismiss them. Fansian smiled and looked at him. He admired this student's natural and easygoing manner, for he dared to make decisions in front of him. The wooden spoon moved slightly in the chicken soup, and the aroma that had been hiding under the soup suddenly came out. Even Fansian could not help but be a little surprised. He took the bowl that Sir Chandley handed over and tasted it. He could not help but praise it. Today, Fansian used the pseudonym Mr. Chun, which was chosen by Chun Ping Ping. At the table, the 3 of them were like normal friends, enjoying the scenery and the food. They drank and chatted and only talked about interesting things in the capital. Deng Ziyu was the person in charge of the Chinian unit, and he was worried about the commissioner's safety. In a place like this, where he did not know if he was friend or foe, he was a little nervous. But under the pressure of the wine and Fan Xian's stern gaze, he relaxed a little. After 3 rounds of wine, Sir Chandley could not help but frown. He lowered his voice and asked, "Mr. Chun, what are we doing here today?" Fan Xian laughed and said, "Of course, we are here to try out the most luxurious things in the capital." After making sure that no one was eavesdropping, he quietly said, "Mutai told me about this place, so of course he had his reasons. But he did not dare to say it, so I thought there must be a reason for it. Every now and then, I come to take a look." Sir Chandley shook his head and gave a wry smile. He said, "Although I feel sorry for the women in this brothel, the life of a prostitute is common, and the law of the Qin kingdom allows it. Why would you place yourself in danger?" Fan Xian used his chopsticks to pick up a thin slice of beef and placed it in his mouth. He slowly chewed and smiled. "This Balua brothel has taken the lives of 4 women in a single month. Their cruelty is something that even I cannot compare to. I'm here to learn from them." Sir Chandley frowned and said, "Criminal cases are handled by the capital's magistrate. The Overwatch Council is only responsible for the officers of the Overwatch Council. They do not have the power to interfere. I think you have other ideas." Deng Ziyu drank some wine and became a little braver. He said, "We are investigating the capital's magistrate for failing to do his job." And he looked at Fan Xian, and after receiving his permission, he lowered his voice and said, "The true owner of this Balua brothel is something the Overwatch Council has not been able to find out. That is why they feel it is strange." Sir Chandley was shocked. The Overwatch Council had spies all over the capital, and they had spies in every manner. They had many eyes and ears, and their power was astonishing. It only took a month for the Overwatch Council to uncover the relationship between the second prince and Xinyan. On the surface, the Balua brothel was just a brothel, and yet the Overwatch Council could not find out who its true owner was. He thought to himself that there was only one possibility. The owner of this brothel had something to do with. Fan Xian knew he understood what he meant. He smiled and said, "This owner is a problem for the 8 bureaus. It looks like someone in the council is covering for him." The most powerful thing about the Overwatch Council was its professionalism and its complex, systematic organization. It was difficult for the council to have any major loopholes. The appearance of Zhu Gu in the first bureau was enough to shock everyone who knew the truth. Zhu Gu had only been dead for 2 days, and now there was someone in the Overwatch Council working for the princes. This was what Fan Xian was most worried about. He was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. How could he allow someone to do as they pleased in his territory? So today he had to come and take a look at this Balua brothel. He wanted to see who was secretly putting their chopsticks into his bowl, and he wanted to take a look at the boring lives of his subordinates. Then what should I do? Although Sir Chandley had a calm temperament, he was still a scholar. This was the first time he had done something so dangerous, and he looked nervous. Fan Xian said, "You do not have the strength to trust a chicken. Since I have brought you, I am just going to take a look." He patted Shi Chanli on the shoulder and said, "I will use public money to entertain you." Shi Chanli was shocked, but he immediately understood what Fan Xian meant. He remembered that he was unmarried, and his face reddened. Fan Xian was surprised. He smiled and said, "No matter what, you and Ho Jichong are both talented young men in the capital. Have you never visited a brothel before? Do you not have many girls you like?" Shi Chanli felt ashamed and said, "I am useless. I am useless." Fan Xian could not help but laugh. He said, "In a place like this, the word useless is not something you can casually say." Not long after, the sky darkened. The setting sun shone on the lake, forming a long, slanted mark. But the weather was not good, so the golden mark on the surface of the water was a bit dim. The lights in the Baoyu brothel quickly lit up. It was as if someone had cast a spell on it. In a very short amount of time, countless colored lights were hung up, illuminating the entire brothel. The shadows of the lights were reflected on the surface of the lake below. It was like stars falling into the water, and it was even more dazzling than the setting sun. The lights were lit, and the people were there. The Baoyu brothel welcomed the busiest time of the day. Many carriages were parked in front of the building. Although the people who came out were all wearing casual clothes, they still exuded the air of a government official. It seemed that they were all officials who often came to the capital. Many of these people were accompanied by wealthy merchants. Fan Xian could use the money from the Overwatch Council to pay off Shi Chanli, but the officials of the 6 ministries were still used to eating from the rich. It was a safe and honorable thing to do. The side of the railing was slightly darker, enveloping the 3 of them. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes to see the light in the darkness. He saw a few officials he had seen at the banquet. However, those officials had directly entered the private room, so he didn't see clearly who was accompanying them. Not long after, the private room was almost full. The second floor began to fill with more and more people. The sound of stringed instruments mingled with the sound of people shouting. It was a very lively scene. The women, who were wearing tube tops, began to walk around the building, and the people grew more and more popular. Fan Xian looked at the leftover food and cold wine on his table, thinking that if the owner of this brothel knew who he was, it would be a different story. "You guys have fun," he ordered. Shi Chanli nervously asked, "Sir, where are you going?" Fan Xian replied, "I came here specifically to relax. Of course, I have to relax a bit. As the saying goes, nothing ventured, nothing gained." He spoke in a gentle and pure manner. Although Deng and Shi Chanli had to believe him, they still felt a bit strange. If you don't enter a brothel, how can you get a prostitute? It seemed to be the same principle. Fan Xian smiled and said, "When you're having fun, remember to get some information. Don't ask about the owner. Just ask about the daily life of these girls. The more detailed, the better. Of course, if it's not convenient, then don't ask. Don't let people see that we have other intentions. That's the most important thing." Deng Ziyu looked at the commissioner. Only now did he truly believe that he was here to investigate secretly and not to visit prostitutes. But such a small matter as getting information out of someone like him did not seem like it was the place for an official of his level to do it, much less for the commissioner to come. At this time, the lamps in the small courtyards by the lake had been lit one by one, blooming with kumquats. Deng Ziyu stood up and waved his hand to summon a servant, saying, "Make the arrangements for our master." The servant extended his hand to receive the gold, which was as thick as a finger, and felt it sink. He was shocked to find out that these 3 were wealthy guests. He did not dare to neglect them, and hurriedly informed the receptionist. The receptionist hurried over and, with a soft and gentle tone, expressed his apologies for the poor reception he had received earlier. He then led the 3 down the stairs, carefully supporting them as they walked. Along the way, he spoke eloquently, as if he wanted to find out where these 3 wealthy guests had come from. Fan Xian did not pay attention to him, and continued to walk forward with his hands behind his back. Shi Chanli laughed and chatted with the receptionist, saying that he was a scholar from Jiangnan who had come to visit the brothel. This was his first time entering the brothel, and he did not know what sort of entertainment this place had. The receptionist laughed and said, "My three masters in this Baiwa brothel, there is nothing you can't think of, but nothing we can't do. You can play whatever you want." As he spoke, he stole a glance at Fan Xian's back. Of course, he could tell that Mr. Chen was the main character of the three today. But looking at Mr. Chen's demeanor, he was no ordinary person. He did not even listen to Shi Chanli's introduction, and he did not even look at him. He guessed that Mr. Chen was the son of some high-ranking official in Jiangnan. The design of Baiwa brothel was very ingenious. After walking down from the restaurant, they arrived at the lakeside. The sounds of birds chattering could be heard coming from the courtyards. The two worlds were connected by a few stone paths in the grass. They did not disturb each other, nor did they interfere with each other. Under the guidance of the receptionist, the three of them entered a courtyard. This room was not like the one above. As soon as they entered, a number of beautiful women came forward to greet them. Their voices were sweet, and their veils fluttered in the wind. They held the arms of the three of them as they entered the room. It was as natural as welcoming a husband returning home. The room was warm, and in the corner was a heating box. In this early autumn weather, it forcibly added some spring warmth. In the corner of the wooden table, there was a pot of fake flowers. The petals were all embroidered with southern silk, and they were very beautiful. Waves of fragrance wafted into his nostrils, and Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He then smiled and turned his head. He spoke to Shi Chanli, who was sitting awkwardly on top of a voluptuous woman, and said, "Relax. There is no tigress in the house." He opened his outer robe, and the woman next to him quickly took it. She warmly said, "I just had some food and wine. Now, would you like to listen to some music or drink some more?" Fan Xian sat down on the soft couch and waved his hand. He said, "Set up another table. I want a singer as well. Give me a massage first." The woman serving him looked very happy and gratefully said, "You are very considerate, sir." She quickly put away his outer robe, and a young servant girl poured tea, which she carefully placed in front of the three of them. She also brought out a few plates of fresh fruits, which were rarely seen in the capital. Then, she half-knelt on the couch and gently placed a pair of soft hands on Fan Xian's shoulders. She gently massaged them. Fan Xian knew that the more he spent here, the more benefits the woman serving him would receive. Feeling the strength of her hands on his shoulders, he thought to himself that the service of the Baoyu brothel was not bad. He then looked at Shi Chanli, who was still fidgeting, and Deng Ziyu, whose face was as serious as if he was still in the middle of a correction. He couldn't help but curse them in his heart. One look, and he could tell that these two were inexperienced, and they were a disgrace to the Overwatch Council and himself. The woman behind him, who was massaging Fan Xian's shoulders, lowered herself lower and lower, and two soft breasts pressed against Fan Xian's back. Fan Xian suddenly realized that he had not asked for her name. He had not even taken a good look at her face. For some reason, he was surprised at how calm and heartless he was. After a moment of silence, he quietly asked, "What is your name?" "Yener." The woman's fragrant sleeves were placed in front of Fan Xian's chest, and her soft and full breasts were cleverly rubbing against Fan Xian's back. Her voice was very soft, and it sounded right next to his ear. Her warm breath blew into his ear. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. He reached out his hand and scratched his ear, explaining, "I'm ticklish." He knew that Yener was a fake name, but it was strange that when he glanced at her earlier, he could tell that she was a beautiful woman, even though she was wearing a lot of makeup. With such beauty, was she just an ordinary member of the Baoyu brothel? Was she someone who could be used to serve a nobody like him? Just as the room was beginning to warm up, the singing girl entered the room. Fan Xian looked at the girl's face, and his heart jumped. He thought to himself that even she had been snatched away by the Baoyu brothel. Chapter 282. The girl who entered the room to sing was called Sang Wan, and she was a famous singer in the capital. In the past, it was not easy for the nobles to see her. The reason why Fan Xian recognized her was because more than a year ago, when he was spending the summer with Wan'er and Ruo's family in the summer resort to the west of the capital, Sang Wan had been invited by Wan'er to sing a song in the villa for a whole afternoon. At that time, the wind was blowing across the lake, and Fan Xian was sitting next to Yiling and Fan Xian. It was the most beautiful moment he had experienced since his rebirth, and the song sang when sang had a line that said, "Suddenly, we meet again." It was a line that matched the first time Fan Xian and Wan'er met at the Qing temple, and so he had a particularly strong impression of her. After Sang Wen entered the room, she bowed slightly and sat down in the corner, expressionless. She held an instrument that looked like a lute, and in a clear voice she said, "What song would you like to hear?" Fan Xian's eyebrows furrowed. He knew that she had not recognized him, but he did not know if she remembered the lines he had written for her. Last summer, when Fan Xian was in the summer resort, he had copied a poem by Tang Xianzu and given it to Sang Wen. Sang Wen used this poem to become even more famous in the capital, but she did not reveal the true author of the poem, as Fan Xian had told her. "Let's sing a song." Fan Xian leaned back into Yin Er's soft embrace and closed his eyes. He picked a song that he was most familiar with, and in his heart, he was wondering how a singer like Sang Wen could have been recruited by the Baoyu brothel, and how could they have sent her out so casually. In addition, Yin was not an ordinary person, either. Had the owner of the Baoyu brothel already seen through his identity? Ding! Ding! Two crisp sounds rang out, and Fan Xian was pulled out his thoughts. He smiled and thought that it made sense. Even if the Baoyu brothel knew who he was and wanted to please him, he did not have to worry about anything. Being a commissioner at night was not a big deal, and the imperial censorate would come and report him. Sang Wen's eyebrows were thin and curved, and she looked very weak. Her lips were not painted, and so they looked a little light. Her facial features were beautiful, but her cheeks were a little too wide, and her face was a little too big. Her mouth was also a little wider than the average beauty. Her fingers brushed across the strings, and her lips parted as she sang. "Why have I come to cover my skirt? For the jade skin and the fragrance of my waist. For the spoons, I sleep like a pancake and breath like a thread. To be killed by JMO, if one is honest, why would he refuse? What should have been a happy ending has turned into a yearning to the bone." Note 1. Her voice was graceful and soft, especially when she reached the part where her breath was like a gossamer. Behind Fan Xian, Yin Er's breathing grew heavier. It was extremely provocative. Fan Xian's eyes were half closed as he listened, and he noticed that there was a wine cup next to his lips. He did not open his eyes, knowing that it was Yin feeding him wine. He opened his mouth and drank it. He felt warm all around him, and the atmosphere was lovely and relaxed. It was a good feeling, and he thought it would be nice to relax for a night like this. As for who the owner of the Baoyu house was, he could find out later. But when the song reached the last few lines, the atmosphere in the room became strange. Fan Xian slowly opened his eyes and looked at Sang Wen, who did not seem to notice anything. He was sure that she did not recognize him, and that she was purposely acting cold. Perhaps she was having an argument with the Baoyu brothel. The last few lines of the song made the meaning of the song clear. This song was written in the language of everyday people, and it vividly described a wife's pain and lovesickness because her husband had not returned from a long journey. The song was simple, and the words were simple, but the meaning was good. It was worthy of Sang Wen's status. But at this time, everyone was visiting prostitutes, and for her to sing a song like this, it was a bit of a wet blanket. Yin saw Fan Xian's calm expression, and for some reason, she felt afraid. She quickly poured another cup of wine and brought it to his lips. She softly begged, "Mr. Chun, this Sang Wen is a famous singer in the capital. Ordinary noblemen would not be able to meet her. Why don't you let her pick a few more songs to sing for you?" Sang Wen did not expect that the popular lady of the Baoyu house would help her out of her predicament. Her sad eyes were now filled with gratitude. She did not want Yinner to suffer because of her conflicted feelings. She knew that the song she had chosen was not appropriate, so she quickly stood up and said, "Mr. Chun, this is Sang Wen's fault." Fan Xian grunted and did not say anything. Everyone in the room looked at his face, and sure Chanli and Deng Zi did not know what Fan Xian was going to do. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian immediately smiled and said, "The people of the capital are different from those of Jiangnan. It is a good place, and even the songs tell people to be kind. Hearing this joke, the girls all felt relieved. Yenner quickly smiled and said, "If you're going to be kind, how am I going to make a living?" Fanxian smiled and patted her leg. His fingers slid across Yenner's slender thighs, taking advantage of her. He did not allow her to rub his shoulders, and instead, they sat side by side and drank. Sangwon regained her spirit and smiled. She sang another song. In the Luofu dream, there is a real immortal with 2 locks and a screw and 9 rings of pearls. Clear willows are soft, spring onions are delicate, and autumn lotuses are round. In the cup of wine, there is a sense of bashfulness, and in the painting, there is the beauty of the cicada. Let me ask you, the moon is setting, what year is it? As soon as she finished, Fanxian was the first to praise her and said sincerely, "Good singing." Tilting his head to look at Yenner's beautiful face, he smiled and said, "So this song is about Yen. Spring onions are delicate, and autumn lotuses are round." His hand followed Yenner's fingers and slipped in her sleeve and squeezed. His other hand gently lifted Yenner's chin and said, "What a beauty. Only you don't drink enough, so you don't have that bashful blush." He looked down at Shi Chanli, who was holding the prostitute, and his face was bright red. He laughed and said, "So this is about you." Hearing his funny words, the girls couldn't help but cover their mouths and laugh. Yenner smiled sweetly and picked up 2 wine glasses. She clinked glasses with him and drank the whole glass. However, she was in a trance for no reason. This child was really a master at manipulating the mood of the audience. Was it really like what Sister Yuan said, that he was an official? It was late at night, and Fanxian had chased Deng Ziyu and Shi Chanli into a room on the side of the courtyard. The room was soundproof, and for a long time, the sounds of the men and women could not be heard. Fanxian could not help but smile. He thought that Deng Ziyu might be able to keep his mind clear, but he was not from the Third Bureau, so it would be difficult for him to get any information from these prostitutes. As for Shi Chanli, the scholar, he was afraid that he had long been stripped and eaten alive by those girls. When he was drinking earlier, he had tasted a trace of aphrodisiac in the wine. He knew that this was a common method used by the brothels, so he did not pay it any mind. Inside the room, Sangwon's expression was one of caution. She carefully looked at Mr. Chan on the couch. She did not know why he had asked her to stay after the banquet was over. Yenner, who was dressed loosely, stroked her hair and looked at Mr. Chun. She was surprised. She thought of the person that the Baiwa brothel had their eyes on tonight, and he wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. She felt a little uncomfortable. No matter what, she was the most popular person in the Baiwa brothel. She did not expect that this young man would not be satisfied, and that he would force Sangwon to stay in the room. She knew that the brothel had spent a lot of effort to get Sangwon to join them. They had even torn down an entire courtyard. But Sangwon was not a prostitute, and she had some reputation in the capital. She had agreed that she would not spend the night with a guest. Just as she was about to smile and explain the situation, she did not expect the young guest to pull her up. She could not help but feel a warmth in her body, and she fell into his arms. Looking up, Yenner could still see the faint smile on Fanxian's face. Her heart skipped a beat. When this young man smiled, the pockmarks on his face were no longer an eyesore. His entire person exuded a sense of gentleness and warmth, and it was indescribable. "Earlier, I troubled you to rub my shoulders. Now, let me rub yours," Fanxian said softly. One of his hands was caressing her waist, and the other was rubbing her temples. He did not allow Yenner to refuse. Yenner's heart froze, and she could not resist the feeling of comfort brought by the steady fingers. Her mind began to blur, and her long eyelashes closed. She slowly fell asleep. Seeing Yenner lying on the man's knees, her head tilted to one side, and then there was no more movement. Sangwon stood up in shock and covered her mouth. Her eyes were full of fear. "Do not be nervous. She is only asleep," Fanxian said gently. He carefully placed the woman who had served him for half the night on the bed. He then carefully fetched a pillow and placed it under her neck. Yenner made a sound of comfort, and her eyes were closed. Who knew what she was doing in her dreams? Seeing this, Sangwon could confirm that Yenner was not dead, but she still carefully retreated to the door. After all, this young man had only rubbed her twice, and then he had hypnotized Yen. It was very strange. Fan Xian sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Sang-won with a smile that was not a smile. He raised his finger and gestured for her to be silent. Sang-won felt her vision blur, and in the next moment, this young man was already by her side. She was shocked and embarrassed, and turned her head, ready to escape from this tiger's den. Unexpectedly, she heard the next sentence in her ear, so quiet that it could not be heard. So the blooming of the purple and the brilliant red is all for the broken well and the broken wall. You are so fickle. You don't even remember me. Sang-won only felt that tonight was really too tense. She looked at this young Master Chun in astonishment. After a long while, she finally found a trace of clarity and tranquility in his eyes that she had always missed. She matched the face in front of her with the face she had seen in heaven last summer. She opened her mouth wide, and her eyes suddenly showed a trace of surprise and sorrow. It seemed that there were countless things she wanted to say to Fan Xian. Fan Xian looked at her expression and knew that his luck had been good that day, but he still shook his head resolutely and stopped her from speaking. He walked to the red toilet behind the bed and squatted down. Circulating the jinqi in his body, his finger like a knife, he quietly tore off the bed curtain, crumpled it into a ball, and stuffed it into the hole behind the hollowed brass armrest. Note 3. Note 1. Yuan, Qiao Ji's order to win the laurel, sent far away. Note 2. Yuan, Qiao Ji's order to win the laurel, sent to Luo Xinjin. Note 3. Today, the country made of clay, old godmother. Chapter 283. The Baiwa brothel was not as simple as it seemed. Looking at the well-hidden eavesdropping equipment, Fan Xian could tell that the owner of this brothel was not only counting on the fact that the sex trade could earn him money, but they were also collecting secrets that the nobles and officials of the capital would never reveal to the public. If Fan Xian had not been so attentive, it would have been difficult for him to notice the strangeness of the armrest next to the toilet bowl. Sang-won looked at him with a strange expression. Suddenly, she gritted her teeth and knelt before Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled warmly and did not stop her. He had already checked to make sure no one could eavesdrop on their conversation. As for why Sang-won knelt, he could guess, but he would not say it. He sat down on a chair and pulled out a blanket to cover Yenner, who was still unconscious. He lowered his head and said, "I ask, and you answer." Sang-won understood, and with a hopeful expression, she stood up from the ground. She carefully stood in front of Fan Xian, but she looked behind him. Fan Xian shook his head. He did not want to spend any more time explaining, but he wanted to reassure her. So he said, "She won't wake up anytime soon, and there is no way she could eavesdrop. Don't worry." Only then did Sang-won nod. Fan Xian did not ask whether or not Tian Chong-room had collapsed, or what the Baiwa brothel had done to get her there. These were useless questions. Instead, he asked, "Do you have a contract with the Baiwa brothel?" Sang-won was happy. She knew Fan Xian wanted to help her escape, and so she quickly said, "Yes, but they forced..." Without waiting for her to finish, Fan Xian continued to ask, "You were sent to serve me today. What did the brothel tell you?" With Sang-won's status, Fan Xian, who was pretending to be Mr. Chun, had no right to make her sing. Sang-won trusted Fan Xian completely, because, in her opinion, only the most popular commissioner of the Overwatch Council in the capital could help her escape from this mysterious brothel. Only he could avenge the Tian Chong room, which had been destroyed. Without hesitation, she said, "I overheard that the brothel suspected you were an ace from the Ministry of Justice's 13 yamens, and that you were here to investigate the murder case a few days ago. So, they sent Yenner the red card." Fan Xian laughed at himself, thinking that he was in disguise, and yet the Baiwa brothel had somehow managed to smell him. It was just that they had guessed in the wrong direction. Sang-won looked at his expression and explained, "The attendant beside you has the aura of an official. That aura is very frightening." He was naturally referring to Deng Ziyu. Fan Xian waved his hand and changed the subject. "I want to know, can you guess who the true owner of this Baiwa brothel is?" He used the word guess because there were people within the Overwatch Council helping to conceal the truth. Sangwon could not possibly know the true owner of the brothel, but she often stayed in the brothel, so there should be some clues. Although Sangwon wasn't sure why the commissioner of the Overwatch Council would be interested in this, she tried her best to remember. She said uncertainly, it should have something to do with Shangshu Alley. Every time the owner of the Baoyu house came, he was very secretive, but the carriage he used was rarely changed. Although there was no family emblem on the carriage, over the past month or two, the roof of the carriage has seen the fallen leaves of a large locust tree. This tree is native to the northern Qi kingdom, and in the entire capital, there is only one row of them on either side of Shangshu Alley. So, I'm certain that the carriage came from Shangshu Alley. Fan Xian looked at her, and Sangwon understood. She immediately explained, when I was young, I lived in Shangshu Alley for many years, so I know about this. Fan Xian did not stop talking. What is the surname of the lady in charge of this brothel? Her surname should be Yuan. The lady spoke quickly, and steadily. Fan Xian looked at her with admiration and said, "You are very meticulous. You can work in my courtyard now." The people who lived in Minister Alley were not ministers, but a group of dukes who had been conferred titles since the founding of the country. They were of high status and power, but now that His Majesty was extremely strict with the country, these dukes were generally more peaceful. As for the lady in charge of the brothel, Fan Xian gave a wry smile. He thought of Yuan Ming, who worked for Hongqing. Having received this piece of useful information, Fan Xian was very satisfied with the results of the night. That was why he was in the mood to chat with Sangwon. From their conversation, he learned that the Baoyu house was indeed very powerful. It had only opened in the early summer, but in such a short amount of time, it had wiped out all the other brothels in the capital that dared to compete with it. The methods used behind the scenes were very bloody. Otherwise, Sangwon would not have been forced to enter the brothel. In a few days, I will send someone to bail you out. Fan Xian was not being merciful, but he was a firm believer in the principle of equality. Furthermore, for this singer to end up in such a gloomy brothel, it was not a good feeling. Warner liked this woman, and in a few days, she would send someone with a name card to the Baoyu house. She believed that the owner of the Baoyu house would give her some face. Sangwon was overjoyed. In the Baoyu house, she had always felt that she was in a precarious situation. She had seen with her own eyes a girl who had been kidnapped from another brothel being beaten to death by the thugs of the brothel. She had always been thinking of a way to escape. Although she had met Fan Xian once, and he had given her a word, she had never thought of looking for him. After all, the difference in status between the two of them was far too great. She did not expect that today, by chance, she would meet the immortal poet again and receive his promise. Considering Fan Xian's position in the court, this matter was set in stone. Thinking of this, Sangwon felt a mixture of emotions. She sobbed and knelt to the ground. Fan Xian had already accepted her kneel once, and he did not want to accept it a second time. At this moment, an angry roar came from outside the courtyard. "I'm going to kill you." Following the angry roar of a middle-aged man, the door was smashed to smithereens. A shadow broke through the wind, and its power was like thunder. The palm of the hand, which contained a great deal of power, came crashing down towards Fan Xian's chest. No! Sangwon was so shocked that she fell to the ground. She saw the face of the man, and she covered her face with her hands. She was shocked and worried. The wind from the palm was like a knife flying towards his face. Fan Xian stood sideways. He did not straighten, nor did he turn his head. He only stretched out his normal right hand from his sleeve and very casually extended it out. His palm seemed slow, but it was an illusion brought about by an extremely strong stability. When his palm had already stretched out horizontally, the sneak attacker's rushing thunder palm had just arrived. A delicate and steady palm moved first, and then arrived later. It gently patted the calloused, incomparably thick palm. It was only a light pat, but it made a loud bang. The sneak attacker, who had come with the power of wind and thunder, came quickly and flew even faster. He was sent flying by Fan Xian's seemingly casual palm, like a flying stone being thrown by a catapult. The wooden door, which had already been smashed to pieces, was attacked again, and the martial artist's retreat did not stop. He crashed directly into the courtyard door, smashing the thick wooden door into pieces. He fell directly into the water and made a big splash. Fan Xian stood in the hall with his hands behind his back. He was strangely quiet, as if he had not made a move earlier. Sangwon looked at the scene in front of her, and she let out an unexpected cry of surprise. She looked at Fan Xian with eyes full of shock. My God, how could such a gentle and amiable lord possess such vigorous and overbearing true qi? But she did not have time to reflect on Fan Xian's palm. She lifted her dress, and with tears on her face, she rushed to the side of the lake. She did not know if the person who had been hit by Fan Xian's palm was dead or alive. Fan Xian's hands, which were behind his back, were stained with grass and mud. He knew that the person had been hiding on the grass outside the courtyard. He frowned slightly and said, "People like the King of Knives are really reckless people." Since Sangwon had a reputation in the capital, there were naturally some people who were devoted to protecting her. Although these Jianghu people could not defeat the Baiwa brothel, they still had to do their best to protect Sangwon from being tainted. The warrior from before must have been waiting outside the courtyard for a long time. After the song ended, he did not see Sangwon leave the hospital. He was anxious, and because he could not see clearly through the window, he mistakenly thought that Fan Xian was trying to take advantage of her. That was why he could not help but protect her. Fan Xian knew that he couldn't hide this situation from anyone. He laughed at himself and walked out of the courtyard with his hands behind his back. Deng Ziyu was already standing guard his side with a murderous look on his face, but sure Chanli was probably still drunk. He turned to look at the second leader of the Qinian unit, whom he had personally chosen, and nodded with satisfaction. Not only was he pleased with Deng Ziyu's reaction speed, but he was even more pleased with the palm he had just used. It was only after that palm strike that he realized that his journey from Danzhou to the capital, from Tsang Mountain to northern Qi, and from the many encounters he had had on his way to northern Qi, had been a rare opportunity. The pressure of the journey, the fight with Xiao In, the fight on the cliffs of Swallow Mountain outside Shangjing, and the seemingly casual but meaningful interaction with Haitang had finally allowed the nameless martial formula he had been practicing to gradually harmonize with his meridians, which were different from those of the common people. His martial arts training had reached a very stable and frightening level. If it had been before, he feared that this palm strike would have shattered his opponent's right arm, but it would not have been so powerful. Thinking of this, Fan Xian could not help but feel grateful to Xiao In, who was already dead, and a Haitang. Of course, he was most grateful to the old cripple for creating such a good opportunity for him. Uncle Wu Zhu did not need to thank him. He was one of us. The ripples on the surface of the lake had not yet subsided, and it was unknown whether the man was dead or alive. Because of the darkness of the night, even with the light from the lakeside, it was impossible to see the color of blood in the lake. In a very short period of time, the Baoyu brothel reacted. Once again, sounds of joy could be heard from the various courtyards, and the man in the lake was scooped up with a net. The fighters of Baoyu brothel gathered by the lakeside, and a middle-aged woman, who walked with the wind, greeted Fan Xian with a look of fear. She apologized profusely, saying, "I did not protect you well enough. I have frightened you, Mr. Chun. I deserve to die." His face was filled with fear, and his words were filled with death. However, his eyes were filled with a probing and cold expression. Chapter 284. Fan Xian saw the woman's eyes flash with a cold light, and he knew that the people of Baoyu brothel had purposely come out late. Even a man had been purposely led into the yard. They must have discovered that he had blocked the eavesdropping device in the room, and they had always been suspicious of his identity. So, they played this game to force both sides to reveal themselves. But they only thought he was from the Ministry of Justice's 13 Yamen, and they had not guessed his true identity. If they had, they would not have welcomed him with such a simple ceremony. The unconscious man was dragged to the front of the crowd, and a large patch of grass was wet. The woman said softly, I heard that a humorous young Master Chan came to this building, but I didn't expect that young Master Chan would have such amazing martial arts cultivation. This was a blatant test. Fan Xian looked at her, but he was too lazy to reply. He walked into the yard. At this time, the door to the yard and the door to the room had been smashed to smithereens, and the warm air inside the room was leaking out. Everything in the hall could be seen clearly. The woman had a suspicious look in her eyes. They had thought that the three of them were experts from the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice who had come to investigate a murder case. That was why they had sent Yin the popular girl, to serve them. They had wanted to take advantage of the time when they were trying to gather information to steal some information. But they hadn't expected that these experts would see through the eavesdropping equipment in the room. They had also discovered that saying one had not come out. Afraid that something had happened, they had cleverly waved their hands and arranged this situation. They thought this Mr. Chun had struck the man and sent him flying. That would have been enough to make a scene, and the two sides could have a few words to say or even bargain. Who would have thought Mr. Chun would treat them as nothing and so coldly walk away? The woman gritted her teeth, and with a face full of smiles, she walked in and said, "The Bayou Brothel's guards were not good enough, and we have startled you. Tonight, the brothel will be responsible for it. Please forgive us." Fan Xian frowned and said, "That's fine. You can leave now." Seeing him respond so casually, the woman grew impatient. She smiled and said, "Mr. Chun, why do you have to keep people at arm's length? When you're outside, you need a few friends." She had already determined that the other party was from the 13th Yamen, so her words gradually became more direct. It was not that Fan Xian was rejecting people thousands of miles away. It was just that the woman in front of him had no right to negotiate with him. He slanted his eyes and glanced at her. "I'm here to play with women, not to make friends." The woman's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't tell the depth of this Master Chun. Her expression softened and she said, "But the gate has been destroyed. Please leave." Fan Xian glanced at her with a not quite there smile and sat back on the bed, too lazy to say anything else. Deng Ziyu said coldly, "My young master doesn't want to move anymore. You can just go and put up a few screens." Open the door for sex? What kind of sick joke was this? Deng Ziyu's face was cold, but his heart felt a little awkward. He was afraid that the girls in the Bayou brothel would think that his commissioner was a nudist. At this moment, the commotion in the courtyard finally startled Shi Chanli out. As he tied on his coat, he walked over. The girls in the courtyard, whose clothes were in disarray, did not enter the main hall. Instead, they waited outside, listening to the conversation between the woman and Fan Xian. The woman's eyes turned to look at Miss Yin who was sleeping on the couch. Her heart skipped a beat, but then she became happy. Pretending to be angry, she gritted her teeth and said, "This damned girl, how can she still sleep at this time of the year? It's a big crime to neglect a guest." She shouted, "Guards, drag this girl away and beat her." Fan Xian frowned, but this was seen by the woman. Her face did not change, and she coldly said, "Beat this girl to death." She thought to herself, "Is this not enough to soften your resolve?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows again and slowly opened his mouth to say, "You're yelling about beating and killing in front of me. It's very annoying. This is someone from your building. If you beat him to death, it's your own business. However, before you beat him to death, pick a good-looking girl over. Remember, I like the more voluptuous ones." His words were calm, but they carried a chill that pierced the heart. This young man, who looked so kind, did not seem to care about the life or death of the girl he had just had intimate contact with. The woman cursed in her heart. She had traveled the world, and she was very good at reading people. She knew that if she really did beat Yin to death in front of him, this Mr. Chun would not even frown. Since when did the 13 Yamens have someone like this? The woman stood rooted to the ground in a daze. Fan Xian was getting impatient. Deng Ziyu knew what he was getting at, and coldly said, "Get out." The woman gritted her teeth. Since the two sides had not yet fallen out with each other, and Fan Xian was still trying to act tough, he was not willing to come up with any rules. The Bayou brothel still had to do business in the capital, and they could not stay in the guest room forever. To everyone's surprise, Just as the woman and the men of the Bayou brothel were about to leave the courtyard, Fan Xian casually said, "Leave that big man here." These words were spoken casually, but there was a hint of authority in them. The woman had been humiliated, and she turned around and said, "Mister, this big man will be handed over to the capital government." Fan Xian finally did as she wished and coldly laughed. "The capital government can handle this, but can't the Ministry of Justice do the same?" The woman laughed to herself and thought, "Finally, you're willing to put up a proper front." But before she could say anything, she heard Fan Xian say, "This Sang-won, I want her." The Bayou brothel had only been in business for a few months, but the power behind it was very strong. The woman knew that her boss had a relationship with the Overwatch Council, and so she was not afraid of the Ministry of Justice. Hearing these rude words, for some reason, she was angry. She coldly said, "Miss Sang's ransom money is very expensive. Mr. or rather, sir, although the 13 yamens are not the same as the government, the only people in the Ministry of Justice who can afford it are the ministers and the 2 vice ministers. May I ask who you are?" Fan Xian raised an eyebrow and said, "I'm not who I am. It's just that I like to hear Sang-won sing. I can afford to pay her 200 taels of silver." The reason why he wanted to bail Sang-won out of the brothel was because she already knew he had a conversation with her in the room. If he allowed Sang-won to stay in the brothel any longer, he was afraid she would become a corpse at the bottom of the lake. The woman was so angry that she started to laugh. She coldly laughed and said, "Good, good, good. It looks like you're using your authority to pressure us. It looks like you do not know the depth of the lake in the capital." Enough chit-chat. Sir Chonli knew it was time for him to speak, and so he mockingly said, "Sang-won is a famous courtesan in the capital. She is not a prostitute in the military. According to the laws of the Qing Kingdom, as long as someone pays the ransom, the Bayou brothel will have to comply. What? Do you think we cannot fork out a few hundred taels of silver?" A few hundred taels of silver? The woman was furious. If someone really wanted to bail Sang-won out, they would have to fork out at least 2,000 taels of silver. These people were here to make a scene, and yet they were asking for a few hundred taels of silver. Fan Xian's provocation had finally made her lose her cool. She angrily said, "If you can bring me 10,000 taels of silver, I will let you take her away immediately. This man will be a complimentary gift. 10,000 taels of silver could buy a dozen houses, and it could provide food and shelter for the commoners for dozens of lifetimes." Even in Jiangnan, where there were many wealthy people, 10,000 taels of silver was an astonishing sum. The woman laughed coldly as she looked at these people. She was certain that no one in this world would use 10,000 taels of silver to purchase an average-looking courtesan who was only good at singing. But Fan Xian had been waiting for this opportunity. Without waiting for her to change her mind, he waved his hand and casually said, "Then it's settled. Bring me the contract." After these words were spoken, everyone was shocked. Even Sang-won, who was standing guard next to the soaked man, had a look of disbelief on her face. The woman, on the other hand, was even more shocked. She stood where she was, as still as a wooden chicken. Slap! A crisp sound rang out. No one knew when, but a beautiful woman had arrived in the courtyard. She slapped the woman hard across the face. She then turned to Fan Xian and smiled. Mr. Chun is indeed a funny person who loves to joke around. Fan Xian did not know who this beautiful woman was. He squinted his eyes and looked at her. Her eyebrows were like willows, and her lips were red. Her eyes were soft, and her lips were soft. His lips curled into a smile of admiration, but he still felt a little uncomfortable. This beautiful woman looked weak, but in reality, there was something very arrogant about her. She looked down on the 3 people in front of her, and he guessed that she was the right-hand man of Lady Yuanming. This is not a joke. Fan Xian's smile faded, and he said, 10,000 taels of silver to buy a man. We agreed on this earlier. Is Bayou brothel going to go back on their word? The beautiful woman looked at him coldly, and after a while, she suddenly said, Bayou brothel will pay 1,000 taels of silver to help you calm down. There is no need to bring this up again. 1,000 taels of silver was the sincerity of Bayou brothel. But Fan Xian looked at the woman's face, which was full of disdain and charity. He mocked, "Tonight is fun, so why would I be surprised? I only want Sang One and a man. Do you dare to sell them?" The beautiful woman did not expect Fan Xian to be so disrespectful, and she mockingly said, "Do you really have 10,000 taels of silver?" At this point, it was no longer a matter of Sang Wen's redemption, nor was it a matter of the Baoyue brothel's investigation. It was a matter of power. The Baoyue brothel would not sell Sang Wen. The beautiful woman said this because she did not believe that anyone would carry 10,000 taels of silver on them. Fan Xian touched the top of his smooth hair and did not say anything. Shi Chanli stood next to him and smiled. He said, "You do not need to worry about this." The beautiful woman coldly looked at the three of them and suddenly said in a cold voice, "So, you are here to humiliate the Baoyue house. Let the three of you know, even if you were to bail Miss Sang out today, I am afraid that tomorrow you will have to return her to us." The threat in her words was very strong, but with Fan Xian's status and power, he did not care about such things. He smiled and looked at her and softly said, "I will give you 10,000 taels of silver tonight. I am afraid you will have to return it to me tomorrow." Chapter 285. In the past, it was the Baoyue brothel that threatened people. Who would dare to threaten the Baoyue brothel? Her name was Shi Qing'er, and she was Yuan Meng's right-hand woman. She thought only a few low-level officers had come to investigate the case, but her subordinates had reported that Mr. Chun had an extraordinary temperament and was highly skilled in martial arts. She assumed he would be a difficult character to deal with, and so she decided to compromise with him. The reason she chose to compromise was because the big boss had asked the Baoyue brothel to behave themselves ever since September. She did not expect him to refuse to make peace, and instead, to threaten her. Shi Qing'er was angry. She stared at Fan Xian and said, "You will regret what you have done tonight. Do not threaten me. Hurry up and bring me the contract." Fan Xian smiled and said, "I am not in the mood for this. I am ready to go home." Seeing Fan Xian's gentle smile, Shi Chanli sighed in his heart. He knew his teacher was not happy, and the consequences would be dire. In a few days, the Baoyue brothel would have to close. Shi Qing'er was angry, and her eyes flashed with anger. She ordered her subordinates to do what they had to do. A short while later, a thin piece of paper was placed on the table in front of everyone. "Cash. If you have 10,000 taels of silver, I will give her to you." Shi Qing'er stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "The law of the Qing kingdom does have a redemption clause, but I cannot leave Lady Sang in the brothel waiting for you to buy her. If you do not bring out the money now, who knows if someone else will buy her?" Fan Xian's face did not change, but he laughed in his heart. Who would spend 10,000 taels of silver to buy someone? If he really did not make a move to buy anyone, then the Baoyue brothel itself would be the buyer. Shi Chanli had already picked up a pen and ink to write a contract. He placed it next to Sang Wen's document and waited for Fan Xian to bring out the banknotes. Shi Chanli had always trusted his teacher's financial ability, and he was a scholar. He always thought money was nothing to a wealthy family. Shi Qing'er stared at Fan Xian. She had seen many rich people in her life, but even the salt merchants and royal merchants of Jiangnan did not have the habit of carrying 10,000 taels of silver in their sleeves. Unless they were preparing to give a gift to a high-ranking official at a banquet, she did not believe the young man in front of her could produce 10,000 taels of silver. It seemed like a long time had passed, but in reality, only a short while had passed. Fan Xian did nothing. Shi Chanli was a little flustered and surprised, but Si Qing'er's lips curled into a proud smile. Fan Xian looked at the beautiful woman's slightly arrogant expression and suddenly felt very good. He smiled and crooked his finger at Deng Ziyu, who had been standing quietly by his side. Deng Ziyu bowed and asked, "Young Master Chun, what can I do for you?" Fan Xian laughed and scolded something in a low voice before saying, "Why are you pretending to be stupid? I don't have that much money on me. I'm borrowing it from you." Deng Ziyu looked embarrassed. Although he didn't know why the commissioner was so sure that he had over 10,000 taels of silver in his pocket, he quickly reached into his pocket. After searching for a long time, he pulled out a pouch that was tightly tied to his undergarments. The pouch was simple, and the inside was slightly bulging. Everyone in the room looked at each other in dismay as they watched Deng Ziyu pull out a stack of banknotes from the ordinary pouch as if he was digging his heart out. Deng Ziyu placed the banknotes on the table and counted them with a pained expression. He picked up 10 bills and handed them over to Si Qing'er. Si Qing'er could no longer keep her face straight. In her hands were 10,000 taels of silver, and her mouth was wide open in shock. Her heart was so shocked that she couldn't speak. In her heart, this young man may have been the son of a wealthy family, but even his follower had 10,000 taels of silver on him. She held the banknotes in her hand and looked at Fan Xian's calm face. She was shocked and thought, what kind of god is this? Fan Xian did not pay attention to the way she looked at him. He gently touched the unconscious Yen'er behind him. His fingers slid across her neck a few times, as if he was flirting with her. Yen'er slowly woke up and covered her mouth with her hand. She yawned, and it seemed that she had slept well. Let's go. He spoke gently and took the lead to get up and walk out of the courtyard. Behind him, Deng Ziyu helped the drenched assailant, whose life and death were unknown. Shi Chanli helped Sang Wan, who had been traumatized, and followed Fan Xian out. Not long after, this group of people of unknown origins followed the lanterns of the thin river and disappeared from the Baoyu brothel. Si Qing'er's fingers tightened, and the 10 banknotes were crumpled. She couldn't bear to part with such a large sum of money, so she carefully tucked them into her bosom. She looked at the back of the group of people and said, "Keep an eye on them." The Baoyu brothel had 2 mysterious owners, and Si Qing'er belonged to the second owner's faction. She was known to be very cruel. At this time, Yen'er frowned and walked forward. Her head was a little dizzy, and looking at the scene in the room, she knew that she hadn't simply fallen asleep. It seemed that the young Mr. Chun, with his kind smile, was indeed a powerful character. Si Qing'er flipped her hand and slapped her across the face. No one expected that Yen'er would coldly dodge. She looked at Si Qing'er and asked, "Sister, why did you hit me?" Si Qing'er gritted her teeth and said, "You useless little bitch. I asked you to come and get information, but you ended up sleeping through the night." Yen'er's eyes swept across the room, and she was able to guess what had happened. She coldly laughed and said, "I am useless, but if you were really capable, why would you allow these people to take Sister Sang away? You will have to explain this to Yuan Ming." Huh. Si Qing'er stared at Yen'er's beautiful face, and with disdain, she said, "Don't think that just because the big boss likes you, you will dare to be rude in front of me. The Baoyu brothel is open for business, and of course, we cannot afford to have a conflict with our customers. There will be a solution to this later." These 2 ladies were the most popular figures in the Baoyu brothel, and so when they spoke, they were both powerful and unyielding. The subordinates quickly retreated from the room, afraid that they would be caught in the crossfire. After a while, Yen'er smiled and said, "Don't forget, the big boss wants you guys to behave yourselves. Don't do anything that goes against the law." "Going against the law?" Si Qing'er coldly laughed and said, "In the capital, we are the law." Yen'er raised an eyebrow and pretended to be confused. She said, "Oh, the person who came today must be someone powerful from the 13 Yamens." "The 13 Yamens are Bulsh *T. Si Qing'er looked murderous. In the entire capital, there aren't many people who are willing to hand over 10,000 taels of silver without a care in the world. He has flipped over the stone boards of the Ministry of Justice and broken all the fire rods, and yet he hasn't even been able to find a few silver coins. I think that person must be the son of some noble family." Yen'er was shocked. She didn't expect Mr. Chun to have such a high status. Thinking back to what he had done, she felt a little lost. Si Qing'er looked at the flirtatious expression on her face and scolded, "You little bitch, don't be so flirtatious. Don't make the big boss unhappy." Yen'er, hearing this, was not afraid. She coldly laughed and said, "Big sister, you arranged for me to accompany a customer. Aren't you afraid that the big boss will be unhappy?" Si Qing'er coldly laughed and said, Mr. Chun is about to become a dead man. What does that have to do with him? Hearing this, Yenner was shocked. Her eyebrows furrowed, and she quietly said, "Are you going to kill someone again? If he dares to humiliate the Baoyu brothel, of course he won't have a good life." Si Qinger's face was full of coldness and arrogance. "Even if I don't kill him because of his identity, I will at least kill that Sang bitch. They can only blame their bad luck." Today, the brothers of the second boss are playing in the brothel. After Yenner heard this, she sentenced Mr. Chun and his people to death. Although she didn't know the identity of the second boss, she knew the brothers of the second boss. They were arrogant throughout the capital. Even if Mr. Chun was a relative of some noble family, and he could survive the night, the people around him would be doomed. She couldn't help but sigh and say, "They're always so reckless. If one day the court investigates, I'm afraid none of us will be able to survive." Si Qinger looked at her with disdain, as if she was mocking her cowardice. She said, "We have the support of the most popular man in the court, and we have the support of the palace. Who do we have to be afraid of?" After leaving the Baoyu brothel, Sang Wen's face was full of tears. She bowed to Fan Xian. Fan Xian couldn't bear to see such a scene unfold, so he said a few words of comfort and quickly climbed into the carriage. The two carriages followed the street in front of the Baoyu brothel and headed for the light. The carriage didn't take many steps before it came to a stop on a long street. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked forward. He was not surprised to see a group of people holding torches and blocking the street. These people were not very old. They were only 14 or 15 years old, and they were still teenagers. Their pale faces revealed their unhealthy lifestyle, and the tall horses they rode were proof of their status. There were also a few servants who were there to protect their masters. They didn't seem to care about what was happening on the street. It was as if they were used to their masters committing murder on the streets of the capital. "You people, get out of the carriage." The leader of the group was a young man. His face was ferocious, and his eyes flashed with excitement. It was as if he was thinking about killing a few more people for fun, and it was something to be happy about. The Baoyu brothel's response is very direct. Fan Xian, who was in the carriage, complimented them. He turned around and asked, "Ziyu, where did these kids come from?" Deng Ziyu's face was serious, and he said, "They are the capital's most famous wanderers. They do not commit any crime, but they are the children of the nobles. So, no one dares to control them." It looks like the Baoyu brothel is not only connected to Hongchang, but also to the nobles. Fan Xian shook his head. He looked at the shadows on both sides of the street, and he knew that the Qinian unit, who had been hiding in the dark, had already made their move. He couldn't help but shake his head again. The Qin kingdom had conquered the world through military force. Although the generals who had followed the founding father to conquer the world had retired and settled down in the capital, they had done a great job. So, many of the nobles had been bestowed their titles. The next few emperors, for the sake of their former glory, looked after the families of the nobles. But they did not allow these elders to have too much influence in the court, and so they were wary of their children. They had done many things in the imperial examinations and careers. As a result, when it came to the third or fourth generation of the nobles, aside from a small number of very talented ones, the rest of the nobles were just empty titles. These people were often in their teens, and their families were wealthy. The court looked favorably upon them, and so they coveted the pleasures of the world. They had nothing else to do, and so they were young and hot-blooded. They bullied men and women in the streets, and they were very arrogant and bored. Often, if there was a disagreement, they would pull out their swords and kill each other. Their actions were cruel and merciless, and they did not care for their own safety. These young men believed themselves to be chivalrous, and they had a group of ruffians in the capital as fighters, so they called themselves wanderers. In reality, in Fan Xian's eyes, they were nothing more than a group of dregs. He didn't know how many women they had harmed and how many lives they had taken. Although Fan Xian was only a few years older than these notoriously fierce young men, his temperament was much more mature than theirs. As soon as he saw the situation on the street, he narrowed his eyes and shrank back into the carriage. He refused to show his face again, and only left the matter to his subordinates. Although the bloodline of the nobles didn't have much power, the twists and turns of their relationships were very complicated. Even Fan Manor and Duke Lu's Manor were related. How could he get away from this? Fan Xian thought that if he didn't have to do it himself, that would be the best choice. "Smash that carriage for me," the leading young man shouted excitedly, urging his horse forward. Behind him, a large group of young men rushed toward Fan Xian's carriage with strange cries. In their hands were the straight swords commonly seen in the capital, and they waved them incessantly. They were as excited as a group of small sharks that had smelled blood. Sang Wen shyly glanced at them, and then quickly retracted her head. She clutched the hem of her dress, and her body trembled a little. She gritted her teeth and didn't make a sound. Fan Xian looked at her and didn't say anything. He opened the curtain a little and looked at the fierce young men rushing toward him on horseback. He thought that the security of the capital was getting worse and worse. But the capital's magistrate was the second prince's man, and these young men had sensitive identities, so no one dared to do anything. But looking at the excited expressions in the young men's eyes, he still felt as disgusted as if he had eaten a fly. Because in the eyes of these young men, and even a little childish, there was a kind of indifference to life, contempt for the lowly, and a perverted love for the smell of blood. Fan Xian was someone who had come into contact with death since he was a child, so taking someone else's life was not scary. In fact, he was quite calm, but he had always been careful not to revel in the process of killing people. On the contrary, he was a person who treasured life and was very happy to have the rest of it. Plus, he thought that tonight, he only wanted to use public money to relax. And yet, as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he had been reduced to fighting with a group of hooligans in the middle of the street. It was very embarrassing. So, Fan Xian was very unhappy. Chapter 286. Suddenly, a whistle rang out. From the houses on both sides of the street, a few black-clothed men jumped down and rushed into the middle of the group of noblemen. In a flash, they scattered the group. The people of the Chinian unit were, after all, long-time spies, and they acted with propriety. They only called out to the other side's horses, and in a moment, the youths all dismounted. But what surprised Fan Xian and the others was that these youths did not fall to the ground. Instead, they stood awkwardly on the ground. It seemed that the martial education of the next generation in the Duke's Manor was quite effective. F***CKU. Cut them down. The leading youth was only about 14 years old, but his face was full of fierceness. Seeing that there were suddenly a few more people on the other side, he was not afraid. These youths had run amok in the capital for a long time. When had they ever been afraid of anyone? He held a knife in his hand and slashed at the black-clothed man closest to him. The knife was sinister and ruthless. This subordinate of Fan Xian knew the noble status of these youths. Seeing that the other side's chest was wide open, he did not dare to hand over his knife. The other side was clearly so young. How could they use such a method of mutual destruction? He dodged to the side, but his left shoulder felt cold. He had been cut open. The youth laughed arrogantly. "These people know who we are. They won't dare to do anything. Brothers, kill to your heart's content." There were many of these youths. Even an elephant could not withstand the entanglement of ants. Furthermore, the people of the Chinian unit all knew the other side's identity, so it was not convenient for them to deal heavy blows. The youths, on the other hand, were used to running amok on the streets. They knew that the people of the court would not dare to kill them for the sake of their grandfathers. So, they used this opportunity to use mutual destruction. Furthermore, they were quite strong. For a moment, the Chinian unit was thrown into confusion. Although some youths were knocked unconscious by the people of the Chinian unit and fell to the ground, the two sides were basically evenly matched. The clanging of knives and swords rang out in the darkness of the long street. The servants holding torches also drew close. There was a little light, and their faces were full of disdain. They were not worried at all. In the carriage, Fan Xian watched this scene, and his expression gradually darkened. He knew that the Chinian unit was his personal bodyguard. Even if they were not as powerful as Gao Da's Tiger Guards, They were more than enough to deal with these young nobles. But these officials of the Overwatch Council had served the court for a long time, and they couldn't do anything to these damned wandering heroes. Although he knew that his subordinates were afraid of causing trouble for him, and that the Chenian unit would rather risk his life than let these youths lay a finger on him, he was very unhappy to see his trusted subordinates fight so vexedly and those youths being so arrogant. It was just like how he felt in his previous life when AC Milan was overturned by Liverpool. Nonsense! Fan Xian walked down from the carriage and cursed angrily. His voice was mixed with his tyrannical jinchi and spread throughout the battlefield on the long street. The battle, which had been separated into several areas, was temporarily stopped by this shout. The members of the Chenian unit took advantage of this opportunity to retreat to the side of the carriage. It was only their first encounter, but there were already 2 people injured. Fresh blood flowed from their bodies. For one, the Chenian unit did not dare to be too ruthless. For another, it was because the youths were too ruthless. Each knife was stabbing toward a fatal spot. Fan Xian looked at his subordinates. A helpless expression rose to his face. When we were fighting the Northern Shi people, why didn't I see you all so useless? The subordinates lowered their heads in shame. Their chests rose and fell continuously. They were not satisfied. They thought to themselves, how could these little bastards be a match for me? But, damn, these little bastards were too ruthless. It was impossible for them to personally kill the grandsons of the dukes. If they fought, they would be at a disadvantage. At this time, Deng Ziyu also got down from the carriage. His face was ashen as he watched the youths coming closer and closer. The youths were laughing arrogantly and holding their blood-stained knives. They looked at the people around the carriage like they were chickens waiting to be slaughtered. Sir, their identity is a bit. Don't worry, we will handle it well. Deng Ziyu looked at Fan Xian's increasingly ugly face and explained in a low voice. Fan Xian was so angry that he laughed and said, Identity? I only know that they're a group of thieves who blocked the road and got themselves injured. If this gets out, people will laugh at us to death. Hey kid, what are you talking about? The leading noble young man had already approached the carriage on horseback, and the trace of hostility between his eyebrows was even more obvious. Hand over the girl in your carriage, and let your useless subordinates break one of their own arms, and I'll let you go today. Fan Xian looked at him, and then turned his head. The noble youth darkly said, You pretty boy, I'm talking to you. Hand over the girl. How dare you oppose the Baliwa brothel? How do you want to die? Do you want to try out our newly invented giant stick punishment? His words were obviously obscene and insulting, and the arrogant youths roared with laughter in unison. Fan Xian did not pay attention to the young man's exclamation. He squinted at his subordinates and continued to say, As long as it is an enemy, you must be ruthless. It does not matter if it is an enemy outside or an enemy inside. Have you not learned this before? Did you think following me was easy, and so you gave it all back to the old cripple? Seeing the young man in front of the carriage ignore his question, the noble youth was angry. His anger rose, and he completely forgot what the Baliwa brothel had told him to do. His mouth was full of profanities, and he lashed out with his horsewhip toward Fan Xian's head. The two of them were still some distance apart, and the horsewhip was only a few feet long. It could not reach Fan Xian's head, so it was probably just a threat. Fan Xian's eyes flashed with the shadow of the whip, and with a flash of coldness, he raised his left hand. Ah! A scream pierced the night sky. The noble youth's horsewhip had long since fallen to the ground. He held his wrist and howled in pain. A black crossbow bolt had shot out like a ghost, piercing through his palm. Fresh blood dripped down the youth's palm, and the surrounding youths were all dumbfounded. God! Fan Xian dared to use a crossbow bolt. He dared to use a crossbow bolt to shoot at them. Did he not know who these people were? Although these youths had committed many crimes and had killed many people before, they lacked respect for life. It could be said that they were cold-blooded by nature, but it was the first time they had encountered someone who dared to use such a deadly weapon to harm them. They could not help but be shocked and a little angry. At this moment, everyone looked at Fan Xian with a strange expression. It was as if they were looking at a dead man. Sir, Deng Ziyu was also shocked. He was afraid that the commissioner would be angered and kill all the little bastards present. If such a big thing really did happen, for the sake of the Qin court and the stability of the military, no matter how much the commissioner was favored by the emperor, he would not have a good ending. Fan Xian slowly withdrew his left hand and released his fingers from the spring. He glanced at the youths around him, but did not respond to Deng Ziyu's words. His indifferent gaze swept over the faces of these youths. He found that they were indeed very young. The youngest was only about 10 years old. Their young faces were filled with savagery. Although they were savagery, they were still children. No wonder the people of the Qinian unit had acted so slowly. He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger in his chest. Narrowing his eyes, he said to the noble youths in front of him, "Those who stand in the way will die. Who else wants to be the little arms of a praying mantis in front of the carriage?" His sinister and terrifying black crossbow bolt only temporarily shocked the minds of these lawless youths. In just a few breaths of time, the fear in the eyes of these youths began to be overshadowed by the audacity and ruthlessness of their eyes. The noble youth who had been shot cried out, "What are you waiting for? Kill them all. Kill them all and drag them to Tsang Mountain to fill in the hole." "Have you killed anyone before?" Fan Xian suddenly tilted his head and asked with great interest. The noble youth paused for a moment and then cried out, "Scum like you, I will kill one every day." As the two of them spoke, the youths had already rushed forward, their faces full of excitement and thirst for blood. Fan Xian waved his hand to stop his subordinate from drawing his sword and preparing to kill. Amidst the shouting, Fan Xian stretched out his right hand with incredible speed and grabbed the wrist of the youth who was coming at him. His fingers tightened, and with a crack, the youth's wrist bone was crushed. He howled and clutched his wrist as he fell to the ground. With a sidestep, he retreated into the arms of another youth. His hand cleverly rested on the other's forearm. Using his own shoulder as a fulcrum, he pushed down. With a crisp sound, like a red book dipped in syrup, this delicate little arm broke from the middle. It was a beautiful roundhouse kick, but he had very treacherously lowered his leg by a foot, sweeping it across the waist of a youth who had leapt at him with a sinister expression on his face. The force of this kick was so great that the youth who had been sent flying, blood spurting from his mouth, would probably be bedridden at home for at least a few months. Taking a step forward, Fan Xian raised his left hand and chopped down on the neck of the attacker. That person didn't even have the chance to make a sound before falling straight down. Fan Xian was like a wandering spirit walking among these ruthless youths who were like wolves and tigers. Every now and then, he would strike down one of them. On the long street, only the sound of bones breaking could be heard. Crack, 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 crack. The disdainful and shameless cursing of the youths had already disappeared. An atmosphere of fear, as more and more people fell, gradually spread outwards. A few youths at the outermost edge had already begun to sneak away towards the end of the long street. Crack, 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 crack. It was like the sound of the night watchman. There was no king of hell in this world, but the youth still felt that the sound of bones breaking was like the merciless and cold beating of a drum. Everyone in the Qinian unit, including Deng Ziyu, stared wide-eyed at the scene. Their eyes were full of admiration and respect. Although they could also beat back these youths, they certainly wouldn't be able to do it as cleanly and efficiently as Fan Xian. His strikes were ruthless and accurate, injuring the opponents so they couldn't get up but not taking their lives. Shi Chanli covered his eyes and shook his head. He couldn't bear to watch this scene. Sangwen, on the other hand, bit her lower lip. Watching Fan Xian's calm actions, she was very excited. She knew what these youths had done. She knew that these youths had harmed who knew how many people in Jingdo. It seemed like a long time had passed, but in reality, it was only a moment. Other than the youths who had escaped, the rest had their bones broken by Fan Xian's heavy hand. They lay wretchedly on the street. Only now did a series of wretched cries begin to ring out. Fan Xian looked at the bleeding youths by his feet, holding their broken limbs. They could no longer be ruthless. He rubbed his newly loosened wrist with some satisfaction. It seemed that the human body structure he had learned from Sir Fei when he was young had not been completely forgotten. Then he told Deng Ziyu very seriously and seriously, "In the future, don't let me act in this kind of situation. I really can't afford to lose face." He walked in front of the noble youth who seemed to be the leader. He smiled warmly and asked, "Which family are you from?" This youth was indeed ruthless. He still had a crossbow in his hand. Looking at Fan Xian's sinister methods, he didn't even blink. Instead, he fiercely said, "If you have the guts, then kill me. Otherwise, just wait for your entire family to be executed." Fan Xian smiled and shook his finger. "First of all, I won't kill you. Second, you can't say things like your entire family to be executed. Only His Majesty has the right to say such things. If you say such things again, perhaps your entire family will be executed." He had no interest in asking this ruthless and obedient noble youth any more questions. He waved his hand and signaled for the driver to drive the carriage over. At this moment, the servants who were holding torches and cheering for their young masters from afar, acting as numb spectators, walked over shakily. Seeing this scene, these servants didn't dare to do anything to the carriage. They only found their masters among the many injured people. They looked at the slowly moving carriage with the eyes of a big black dog. At this time, Fan Xian and his group had already boarded the carriage. The two injured subordinates, full of shame, disappeared into the night. In the carriage, Fan Xian closed his eyes and rested, as if he hadn't acted earlier. The others in the carriage saw that he was silent and naturally didn't dare to speak. Suddenly, Fan Xian opened his eyes and quietly said, "This is strange. For the sake of a brothel, how could they order around these bloodthirsty bastards?" Deng Ziyu asked, "After injuring so many young nobles, do you want to make some preparations? After all, the identity of a master cannot be hidden from many people." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "They are just a group of nobles. There is no need to pay attention to them. The key is the person behind them." Deng Ziyu lowered his voice and asked, "What should we do next?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Tomorrow, you go to the Baoyue brothel and take back the 10,000 liang of silver." Chapter 287. The carriage followed the quiet streets of the capital and made a few turns. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise coming from a house on the side of the street, but it was not very loud. Deng Ziyu turned his head and reported, "The servants that were following us have been knocked unconscious. The road is clear." Fan Xian smiled wryly and nodded. He said, "Speaking of which, it is strange. Although you were personally chosen by Wang Qinian, I have looked over your records. You are good at following and hiding. How could you have made a move? How come you did not have the authority and prestige of the Overwatch Council?" Deng Ziyu felt ashamed and explained, "Sir, the members of our team are mostly old men from the first and second bureau. Sir Wang is best at following people, so he chose us because we are good at this." He thought for a moment and then said, "Sir, I cannot believe that you have to personally deal with this matter today. It is a dereliction of duty on our part. But could you please transfer some people from the 6th Bureau? They're the true assassins of the Overwatch Council. On the road north, you have seen their abilities. In terms of fighting, they are much stronger than we are." Fan Xian shook his head and did not say anything. He was a little afraid of dealing with the shadow. Occasionally, when he went to visit Qin Pingping, he had seen the assassin appear. Although he was silent, it was clear that the leader of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council was very interested in Fan Xian, who had once studied under Wu Zhu. This interest was not due to the fact that he was gay. It was due to the fact that he wanted to fight Fan Xian. Therefore, he was a little afraid of dealing with the 6th Bureau. In terms of fighting ability, the Tiger Guards that his father had secretly trained seemed to be stronger than the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. According to Yin Bingyun's calculations, Fan Xian should be able to get his hands on these Tiger Guards in a few days, so he was not in a hurry. Investigate all the illegal activities of the Baoyu brothel. He quietly gave the order. Deng Ziyu was shocked and asked, "What about the owner of the brothel?" Fan Xian thought for a while and shook his head, saying, "Since the yard is covering for him, we should first attack the outside. First, we will seal off the Baoyu brothel. That will make the man anxious. In fact, He had a feeling that this brothel, which was raking in money every day, had something to do with Li Hongqin. First of all, Sangwon had said that the mistress of the Baoyu brothel had the surname of Yuan. Secondly, he was able to make use of the brats of the public houses. Furthermore, the marriage between Ro and Crown Prince Jing had long been made known throughout the land. If the second prince was using this as a pretext to suppress the Overwatch Council, then that was a possibility. Thinking that the other party might be using this matter, Fan Xian's anger gradually grew. Although he was working to destroy this marriage, he still would not allow anyone to use his and his sister's name. Fan Xian could not help but feel angry. He looked at Sangwon, who was quietly sitting next to him, and said, "I will have someone escort you out of the city. Once this case is over, you can come back. But first, you'll have to write a report. Tell me everything you know." Through his conversation with Sangwon, he knew that this girl was very thoughtful and well-organized. She would be of great help to the Baoyu brothel. Deng Ziyu did not understand Fan Xian's intentions in dealing with the Baoyu brothel. He thought that Fan Xian only wanted to vent his anger and find out who within the Overwatch Council was covering for them. Shi Chanli thought a little more, and he looked at his teacher. After receiving a nod, he spoke to Sangwon, "Sir, why don't you ask Mutai? After all, he is the head of the first bureau. When you were not in the capital, Baoyu brothel was on the rise. If he reminded you, then he must know something." Fan Xian closed his eyes and shook his head. "If Mutai only reminded me and did not explain everything, then this matter must have something to do with me or my family. If he was able to speak up, that would be enough. There is no need for me to drag him into this. Besides, this is such a small matter. If I cannot handle it myself, how am I going to make a name for myself in politics?" The carriage fell silent, and the atmosphere was a little strange. After all, everyone had just witnessed Fan Xian strike like a ghost. Now, they looked at this man with a gentle smile on his face, and it felt strange. Fan Xian's martial arts skills, ever since the Nyolan Mountain incident last year, had been known to the world. But the people who had actually seen him fight were few and far between. That was because those people were all dead. So a scene like this one was very rare. Although Fan Xian had warned Mutai not to imitate Wang Qinyan's style of flattery, and Deng Ziyu had been listening to him, he could not help but imitate his predecessor's style of doing things. He carefully asked, "Sir, earlier in the Baoyu brothel, why were you so certain that I had so many banknotes on me?" Fan Xian lazily opened his eyes and smiled at him. He said, "Last time, the Chui family gave you 20,000 taels of silver. You said you were worried about your subordinates spending money, so you only gave each of them 100 taels of silver. Here is 3,200 taels of silver. Then, you gave 5,000 taels of silver to Wang Qinyan's family. That leaves you with 11,800 taels of silver." He closed his eyes and said, "You are a thrifty person. Food and clothing are all paid for by the public purse. You even gave Mr. Peng's son's wedding a red packet of 5 taels of silver. After the wedding, you complained to me a few times, saying you wanted to put a stop to this unhealthy practice. It looks like at the very most, you can only earn 2 taels of silver a month. You and Wang Qinyan are not the same. You have never married, and you are a single man. Where would you put the remaining 10,000 taels of silver? You are such a cautious person. Of course you would not leave it at home. Of course, you would carry it with you." Fan Xian laughed and patted Deng Ziyu on the shoulder. "But being thrifty is one thing. The widow next to you is not willing to take her in. Then, you should make a few pieces of jewelry. Don't let a woman think you are stingy and stingy. The Overwatch Council cannot afford to lose face like that." The people in the carriage all laughed. Deng Ziyu looked embarrassed and explained, "Sir, about this silver, I reported it to you before I distributed it. 100 taels of silver is not a small amount." Fan Xian laughed and said, "If you are so stingy, how can you be so generous to the Wang family? He is not your superior right now." Deng Ziyu was silent for a moment, then said, "Sir Wang, he is in northern Qi. I always think that if there's a problem, his family will need the silver." Fan Xian did not expect him to say something like this. He sighed and felt a little touched. If it were an ordinary envoy or a student of the Qin kingdom, staying in northern Qi would be very safe. In the words of another world, they would be able to enjoy national treatment. But for a spy like Wang Qinian, who knew what would happen to him in the future, Shi Chanli asked, "Are we really going to the Baoyu brothel tomorrow to ask for the silver?" Fan Xian was thinking about Wang Qinian, who was far away in a foreign land. He thought about the recent news that Sea Lily had entered the palace, and his feelings were complicated. Hearing this, he became angry. The Overwatch Council worked hard for the court, but the princes and nobles in the court were fighting each other fiercely. They even wanted to drag the council into these muddy waters. It was truly a bit hateful. "Of course I am going." He looked at Deng Ziyu and coldly said, "Reveal your identity." Earlier, when I was talking to that woman, she said that I had ransomed Sang-won from the Baoyu brothel, and that I would return her the next day. But then they came to take her. For an enemy to do what he said, we have to be respectful and courteous. Since we said we would get the 10,000 taels of silver tomorrow, then we must get it back, he said without any hesitation. Tang Zijing received the order and prepared to send Sang-won to the estate outside the city the next day, when the city gates opened. After taking care of these matters, Fan Xian returned to his room. Inside the quilt, Wonder saw the worry on his face. She felt sorry for him and asked him what happened. Fan Xian did not hide it from her, and he told her what had happened. Of course, using public funds to buy a prostitute was an opportunity to investigate the case, and it was very open and above board. Wana looked thoughtful and said, "There is something strange about this." Fan Xian nodded and said, "I think so too." Wana had lived in the palace for a long time, and she did not know much about the public houses in Shangshu Alley. After all, their status was different, so she said, "Tomorrow, find a chance to ask Xija's mother." Lucia grew up in Shangshu Alley, and her family is a public house. She should be able to get some information. Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat, but he immediately denied his own suspicions. Lucia was a shrewd and ruthless person, and she would not drag him down while he was still popular. He now had a better understanding of Lucia. This woman had always put the interests of Fan Manor and his father first. "Are you going to Baoyu brothel tomorrow?" Wana frowned and said, "Those children are notorious in the capital. Although you are not afraid of them, you still have to be careful." Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Do not worry about me. I have always been wary of such things." He smiled warmly and said, "When I was a child in Danzhou, what I wanted to do the most was to beat up the hedonistic young masters on the street. But I never got to do that. I never thought I would be able to satisfy my childhood fantasies tonight." Wanner gently touched his chest and said, "Danzhou? You must be the biggest hedonist there is." Fan Xian did not respond. He said, "The scariest thing in the world is not a cold-blooded killer. It is those rich and powerful young men who love to kill without asking for a reason. Because a killer must have a reason to kill, and these rich and powerful young men are just reveling in excitement. If babies could kill, then they would do it for a drop of milk because babies are at their most instinctive stage. They do not feel guilty because they do not understand anything. Therefore, the younger the young nobles in the capital, the less reverence they have for the court and the world. The more ruthless they are, the more daring they are. Once this opening is loosened, it will be like the dam in Jiangnan this year, unable to be blocked again." He shook his head and thought of the ruthless young men who fell at his hands. The deepest worry in his heart floated to the surface in his clear eyes. That night, the fight on the street immediately startled many people. The capital government, which was responsible for the security of the capital, bore the most pressure. The young bullies who ran amok on the street, relying on their family background and the generous treatment of the government, had always been ruthless and lawless. This time, they had stopped the street for a fight and ended up in such a wretched state. It was very surprising. The official in charge of investigating the case, after seeing the injuries of the youths with broken bones and tendons, was shocked. He felt a trace of fear and suspicion towards the culprit, Mr. Chun. It was obvious that the culprit did not care about the power of the dukes. Where did this ruthless person come from? Just as Deng Ziyu said, Fan Xian's identity could not be hidden from everyone in the capital. After the details of that night's events were spread out, although the capital government had not yet found out who this Mr. Chun was, the smart ones were able to smell a familiar scent from the men in black who jumped out of the houses on the street. Everyone knew that the young commissioner of the Overwatch Council had a group of people called the Qinian Unit. Let Yuan Ming come back. The second prince of the Qing kingdom had a gentle expression on his face. He said, "If you offend Fan Xian, you will not have a good life." The crown prince, Li Hongsheng, slowly walked to the window. He felt a chill in his heart. He knew that his cousin was a very meticulous person. He quietly said, "No one would have guessed that Fan Xian would go to a brothel. Knowing his stubborn personality, there is no way he would let this go." The second prince smiled and grabbed a dried fruit from the small plate next to him. He peeled off the skin and placed it in his mouth. He slowly chewed and said, "The more Fan Xian investigates, the more solid the evidence of the Baoyu brothel is. This will only get more and more interesting." Li Hongsheng turned to look at him and coldly said, "From the beginning, this was your plan. But why did you give Fan Xian the opportunity to make a move?" The second prince seemed to be lost in thought. After a while, he said, "Because I'm still looking for a way to reconcile with Fan Xian. The Baoyu brothel is the last chance. If Fan Xian is willing to extend his hand, I will sincerely shake it. I want to give him the opportunity to shake my hand." Chapter 288. The capital government was restricted by the second prince's warning, and they knew that the owner of the Baoyu house had a close relationship with the notorious young thugs of the capital. So, they turned a blind eye to the Baoyu house. The Overwatch Council, however, did not have such concerns. Although they did not have the power to investigate the civil affairs of the capital, they used the excuse of investigating the capital government's malfeasance to find a lot of relevant information. Fan Xian sat in his study and looked at the case in front of him. He could not help but frown deeply. There were two owners of the Baoyu house, and they were very mysterious. Not many people had seen them before. As for the way the Baoyu brothel did things, they were indeed extremely daring. They did things ruthlessly and ruthlessly. They had only opened this spring, and it had only taken a few months for them to use both force and money to shut down the businesses of the other brothels. They had forcefully taken many famous prostitutes into the brothel, and their reputation had suddenly increased. In his trip to the Baoyu house, Fan Xian could tell from the details that the owner of the brothel was a master of business. But under the methods of a normal merchant, there was a dark side to this business. Mutai was right. In just 1 month, 4 disobedient prostitutes had disappeared. They must have died a long time ago. The Baoyu house did even more dirty things in the dark. They accepted young prostitutes and perverted businesses. Fan Xian's frown deepened, and his heart grew colder and colder. Regardless of whether it was his previous life or this one, the world was always dirty. It was just that the sky above Jingdo in the kingdom of Qing was easier to bring to the surface. The nobles relied on the power and position in their hands to endlessly exploit and oppress the common people. Just like what happened with Baoyu brothel, in the officialdom of Jingdo, it was not an exception, nor was it the first. It was a method that all the nobles were used to accumulating wealth. In regards to the poor, the lowly, and the unjust in the past, Fan Xian was more of a bystander. He coldly watched the ugly things that happened in the world, and he subconsciously did not think about the unfairness and darkness. He was not the bodhisattva of Guanyin, who saved people from suffering. He had received enough benefits and enjoyment from his position. As someone who had benefited from this, and as a member of the nobles, he naturally chose to be silent and accept it. Silence and acceptance did not mean that he could get used to it. Even though he had been in this jar filled with dirty water for a long time, he still could not get used to it. A mere Baoyu house was not enough to make him change his mind. He might have done something good within his power, such as ransoming Sangwon and suppressing the Baoyu house. He wanted the nobles to be gentler when they did things, and he wanted to reconcile the conflicts between the different classes. But he would not try to react like a thunderbolt, because a thunderous reaction meant denying everything that the Baoyue house represented. It meant challenging the entire world. Such a heaven-defying thing. Only Yi Qingmei seemed to have attempted it before. His mother seemed to have failed in the end. But the Baoyue brothel did not seem to be as simple as a brothel. Fan Xian could already smell the uneasiness hidden within. Deep in his heart, an ominous feeling welled up, and an evil fire was born out of nowhere. So, he wanted to personally go to the Baoyue house to confirm whether or not his judgment was correct. It was a sunny, autumn afternoon. As the leader of the Qinian unit, Deng Ziyu once again came to the Baoyue house. Seeing his lifeless face, the hired thugs of the Baoyue house rushed forward, ready to beat him to a pulp. But when they saw his lifeless clothes, all the thugs took half a step back. It was as if they were afraid of the coldness that seeped out of his clothes. Deng Ziyu was wearing the uniform of the Overwatch Council, so his identity was different. The Baoyue brothel believed that they had the backing of the Overwatch Council, so they would not do anything to offend the Dragon King. They immediately sent out a person of status to respectfully welcome Fan Xian into a quiet room on the 3rd floor. There was a curtain in the room, so it was impossible to see what was behind it. Beyond the curtain was a round table made of Qingzhou stone. It looked very noble. Si Qing'er was full of smiles as she welcomed Deng Ziyu to the table and sat down. She said, "Sir, you are from the Overwatch Council. Last night was very rude. If I had known you were from the Overwatch Council, I would have given Sang one to you. I would not have dared to accept your banknotes." As she spoke, her eyes looked into the curtain, but she made no move to take out the banknotes. Deng Ziyu knew that there was someone behind the curtain. Perhaps it was the mysterious owner of the Baoyue house. He had been in the Overwatch Council for 8 years, and he had never done business that involved taking advantage of his authority. But Fan Xian had forced him to take back the 10,000 tael banknotes, so he had no choice but to make another trip. After a moment of consideration, he coldly laughed and said, "Lady Si Qing'er is very polite. It is just that last night when I left the house, I bumped into a few dogs. Today, I'm here to ask if these dogs belong to the house." Si Qing'er's face did not change, but she was a little worried. Last night, she thought they were from the 13th Yamen. She did not expect them to be connected to the Overwatch Council. The brothers of the second owner used to run amok in the capital, but last night, they were beaten to a pulp by this man. Today, the man had come to her door again, and his words were sharp and unkind. It seemed that it would be difficult to resolve this peacefully. It was a shame that time had been tight, and she had not been able to find out the man's bottom line. Because of some reason, the Baoyue house did not expect Mr. Chun to be Commissioner Fan. But she still did not think much of the mysterious Mr. Chun, and she would not spit out the 10,000 tael banknotes. This was because the person behind the curtain had given her enough confidence. Si Qing'er's face turned cold, and she coldly laughed and said, "Sir, you are very funny. Since when did the Overwatch Council become involved in the business of a brothel? Shouldn't this be the business of the capital government? If you were bitten by a dog, you should be careful not to get sick. You should go home and rest. Why are you here to take care of our business?" She smiled and said, "Sir, you are very fierce." Deng Ziyu's face was stern, and he said, "Stop talking nonsense. If you do not give me an explanation for what happened yesterday, I will tear down this broken brothel of yours." He had been ordered to come here, and he felt very uncomfortable. But his long years of working in the Overwatch Council made his words sound cold and oppressive. Behind the curtain, someone coughed. Si Qing'er's face darkened, and she slapped the Qingzhou stone table. She angrily shouted, "I don't know where this bastard came from. How dare he come to the Baoyue house and extort money from us? The contract was written clearly. You have forcefully bought Sang One, and yet you are not satisfied? If you do not leave, I will strip you of all your clothes and throw you out the door. I will let everyone in the capital see how ugly you are." Deng Ziyu stared into her eyes, and his ears listened to what was happening behind the curtain. He coldly said, "It looks like your brothel is ready to make an enemy of the Overwatch Council. It was just a brothel, and it did not have the right to make an enemy of the terrifying Overwatch Council." But Si Qing'er did not panic. She coldly laughed and said, "Do not use the Overwatch Council to scare me. The 6 departments and 3 departments may fall for it, but the Bayou House will not." Deng Ziyu laughed and said, "You have guts." He stood up, looked coldly behind the curtain, and waved his sleeves, ready to leave. "Stop right there." It had been quiet, and only 2 coughs could be heard from behind the curtain. Finally, someone spoke. The voice was young, but it carried with it a sense of disdain and power. The green curtains slowly opened, and the owner of the Bayou House, who had never seen an outsider before, finally appeared in front of the world. Deng Ziyu turned his head, and his eyes narrowed. He did not know who this person was. He did not expect that he would meet with him. He looked at the young man behind the curtain, who was wearing light yellow clothing. Deep in his heart, he felt it was ridiculous. The Bayou House was the largest brothel in the capital. It was a brothel that opened its doors every day to welcome customers. It was a brothel that was open every night, and its owner was a boy who was not even 10 years old. Deng Ziyu stared at the yellow-robed little boy with his mouth agape. He suddenly furrowed his brows. Although the little boy's identity was not ordinary, he had suddenly become the owner of the Bayou brothel. It was truly shocking. After a moment of silence, he finally bent his knees and said, "Deng Ziyu of the Overwatch Council greets the 3rd prince." The 3rd prince? The youngest son of the emperor was the owner of the Bayou House. Seeing the Overwatch Council official, who had always had a cruel expression on his face, admit defeat and kneel in front of the second owner, Si Qing'er's lips curled up, and she let out a cold laugh. So what if the Overwatch Council was powerful? They were just a dog of the emperor. Her brothel looked ordinary, but behind it was the youngest son of the emperor. "Mr. Deng, is there anything else you would like to say?" Si Qing'er's face was full of disdain. Unexpectedly, after Deng Ziyu knelt, he did not wait for the young man to speak. He stood up and spoke with a serious face. "I have come under the orders of the emperor to ask questions. The girl has yet to answer. When I return, I will report back to the emperor. As for what happens in the future, the Overwatch Council will be in charge." The 3rd prince was the youngest son of the emperor of the Qing kingdom. His mother was Yi Pin, who was very favored in the palace. How could a child like him open a brothel? Although this reality was absurd, it was right in front of his eyes. Deng Ziyu's temples jumped, and he suppressed the emotions in his heart. He bowed and said, "I will take my leave." The 3rd prince's face was still childish. Seeing that this little official wanted to leave just like this, a wave of anger rushed into his brain. He threw a teacup at him. Although Fan Xian had seen at the city gate that the 3rd prince was young and had a lot of calculations in his mind, he was, after all, still a child. He did not receive the respect he wanted, so he flew into a rage. The 3rd prince walked forward, pointed at Deng Ziyu's nose, and yelled, "You want to leave? Why did you stop investigating? Didn't you want me to pay you back 10,000 liang of silver?" Deng Ziyu had a wry smile on his face. No matter how powerful the Overwatch Council was, they could not compete with a prince for money. But according to the emperor's way of doing things, the Overwatch Council did not give the prince any face. Fan Xian had warned him again and again last night. Deng Ziyu was the commissioner's trusted aide, and so he did not dare lose face in front of the prince. So he maintained a polite expression and said, "The matter of the money will be discussed by the emperor. But the 3rd prince, it is best that you do not get involved in such places." Si Qing'er, who was standing to the side, was shocked. She thought to herself that the Overwatch Council was as arrogant as the rumors said. They did not even give face to a prince. The 3rd prince was only 8 or 9 years old, but he was born into a royal family. The little boy was born with power, and his mind was not simple. He laughed coldly and said, "When did the Overwatch Council become beggars? Asking for money everywhere? How dare you not give me face? Cousin, do you know who this person is?" As he spoke, the half-drawn curtains were pulled back to reveal a group of thugs lying in ambush. Looking at the faces of these thugs, Deng Ziyu's expression froze. He felt that the strength of these thugs was far greater than that of the average thug. And in front of these thugs stood 2 young men. One of them had a ferocious look on his face, and his right hand was bandaged. There was blood seeping from it. It was the man who had his hand pierced by Fan Xian's crossbow the night before. Deng Ziyu's eyelid twitched. He knew that today would not be a good day. But he looked at the person next to the young man who had his hand pierced. His face looked even worse. He was even more shocked than when he found out that the owner of the Baoyu house was the young third prince. He frowned and looked at the chubby young man's left cheek. After a moment of silence, he asked, "Young master, are you also the owner of the Baoyu house?" This chubby young man was none other than Fan Xian's little brother, Fan Xizha. Deng Ziyu did not expect that the Baoyu house that the commissioner wanted to investigate was owned by his own little brother. Compared to the arrogant third prince, and compared to the thugs in the room who wanted to teach Deng Ziyu a lesson, Fan Xizha's face looked particularly ugly. His face was pale, and aside from the occasional glint in his eyes, there was a fear that came from the depths of his heart. He angrily looked at the third prince and said, "You idiot! Do you know who he is?" The third prince was shocked. He thought to himself, "Even if you are my cousin, why are you insulting me?" He angrily retorted, "How dare you insult me?" Fan Xizha gritted his teeth and took a deep breath. He knew what had happened the night before, and so today he had brought people to take a look. These people who dared to cut off his path to riches were small characters from the 13 Yamens. He did not expect them to be people from the Overwatch Council. He closed his eyes and took 2 deep breaths. Looking at the third prince, he shook his head and said, "Look at what you have done." His heart jumped, and he knew that someone was hiding something from him. The third prince and Fan Xizha were cousins. At the beginning of the year, they had been persuaded to open the Baoyu house together. Everything had been smooth sailing, and he knew that his cousin was a genius in business. But he did not understand why he was acting so strangely today. Even if they were people from the Overwatch Council, what was there to be afraid of? He was a prince, and his brother was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. His young face was full of confusion. Fan Xizha sighed in his heart, and then he looked at Deng Ziyu with hope. He asked, "Mr. Chun from last night, was he?" Deng Ziyu calmly looked at the young man. He did not know why, but he felt a little sad for Fan Xizha, and so he nodded. Fan Xizha's face was wooden. He seemed to be stunned, but his heart was quickly calculating whether or not he should kill Deng Ziyu in front of him, and then quickly escape from the Baoyu brothel. If his brother found out, what would happen to him? Chapter 289. What kind of person was Fan Xizha? In reality, he was just a common youth in the capital with an excellent family background. That was why he was a famous tyrant in the capital. He was the 12-year-old who had stared at Fan Xian when he first entered the capital, his face full of disgust. Of course, he also had some brains and knew how to restrain his heir to the title of count. At the same time, he was also a young boy who often revealed his naivety and competitiveness at the mahjong table. He was also a genius who often flipped through account books and developed a fanatical interest that even he himself could not imagine. There were many sides to a person, and Fan Xizha was no exception. He was naive, fanatical, arrogant, and ruthless. If you looked at him from any of these sides, you would be biased. His father was a popular figure in the court, the Minister of Revenue, Count Sinan. His grandmother was the emperor's wet nurse. His biological mother was the sister of Yi Guipin, and his sister Fan Ro was the most famous and talented woman in the capital. She was about to marry Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongsheng. As for his brother, the one who had vaguely been an enemy, but had actually gotten along well with him, he was the immortal poet of a generation, the most favored young official of the emperor, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and the idol of all scholars. The one who had married a princess, was about to take over the palace treasury, had a seat in the royal study, and was visited by geniuses. He was so red that it was almost purple, and his name seemed to have been framed in gold that no one dared to look directly at. Yes, his good older brother was Fan Xian, Sir Fan Jr. Since the founding of the kingdom of Qing, such a family background had never appeared. What kind of youth would be born into such a hot environment? Before Fan Xian came to the capital, Fan Xizha was already a famous thug in the capital. But at the time, he was still young and had not yet found his own direction in life. So all he did was eat for free steal things, ride a horse through the streets, and act like a little tyrant. After all, Ro was there to enforce the family rules, so he did not cause any big trouble. But this kind of life had long been planted in his bones, and the seeds of daring had long since been planted in his bones. After Fan Xian entered the capital, his powerful older brother and sister joined forces to make Fan Xizha obedient. On the other hand, Fan Xian, who had always been pressured by his parents to study and become an official, had been weakened by Fan Xian's arrival. Fan Xian seemed to have opened a window for his younger brother that was completely different from that of other nobles. Fan Xizha finally understood what he liked to do and what he should do in the future. His future was to become the mistress of the Yi family, the kind of wealthy merchant who could rival a nation. He would be able to fully utilize his talent in business and accounting books. As he gradually grew older, his firm goals in life, his genius calculating mind, and the tyrannical aura he had always possessed combined to form the bold and reckless Fan Xizha of today. If he wanted to do business, then what would make him the most money? Of course, it was food, drink, and men. Although the Dambo bookstore, under the management of the young man and the seventh shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, was gradually expanding to the whole world, the profits from selling books were not large. Secondly, the bookstore was more or less marked by Fan Xian. Although Fan Xizha did not care about this, he was more concerned about what he could do. At the same time, the third prince in the palace, his cousin, was not satisfied with listening to the Grand Tutor's lectures every day. Using a brain that was far more mature than his peers, he began to discuss with Fan Xizha how to stir up some activity in the capital. One was 14 years old, and the other was only 8. This strange combination created the popular Baiwa brothel in the capital. Because the background of these two boys was too special, this seemingly childish combination brought about unexpected results. The resistance of the government naturally became a help. And when Fan Xizha was pleasantly surprised to discover that Crown Prince Li Hongsheng had a close relationship with the brothel business on the other side of Lujing River, he unceremoniously borrowed the popular maid, Yuan Meng, from Li Hongsheng. With Fan Xizha's business vision, with Yuan Meng's understanding of the business, with the power of the third prince, and with these two boys who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth, in less than 2 or 3 months, the Baiwa brothel swept through the entire business in the capital. As for how many people died in the process, and how many innocent girls were ruined, it was not within the scope of his consideration. His name was Fan Xizha. Although he was young, he was still a nobleman. As a nobleman, who cared about the life and death of flesh and blood on the cutting board. Furthermore, as a young man, he did things without fear. This was what Fan Xian was most worried about when he spoke with Wanner that night. But Fan Xizha was still afraid. So the Baoyu brothel truly began to flourish a month after Fan Xian was sent to northern Qi Kingdom. A few months had passed, and the Baoyu brothel had firmly established itself in the capital. Fan Xizha's worry had lessened, and he thought that even if his brother found out he was running a brothel business, what was done could not be undone. But what he did not expect was that in the half a year since his brother had left for northern Qi, the situation in the court had changed so much. In the spring, the Fan family had a close relationship with King Jing's family. In the eyes of the court officials, they were on the second prince's side. So, Fan Xizha did not think there was anything wrong with him associating with Li Hongsheng, his future brother-in-law. He did not think there was anything wrong with him associating with the third prince, who had been raised by the second prince. But after Fan Xian returned to the capital, Fan Xizha was shocked to learn that his brother seemed to be in conflict with the second prince. As the son of an official, Fan Xizha didn't think that his evil deeds in the capital would make his elder brother angry. But his political acumen told him that if his elder brother found out that he was too close to the other side, there would certainly be problems. So, in September, he began to tell the people working in the Baiwa brothel to keep a low profile. He was anxious to get out of this business, and so he had been very busy. But he did not know who had told the third prince to hide in the palace, and he had dragged things out until today. Fan Xizha looked at Deng Ziyu, who was standing in front of him. He had seen this Overwatch Council official in the manor, and he knew that he was the leader of Fan Xian's entourage. But in the blink of an eye, he gave up on the idea of killing Deng Ziyu. He knew that he was the owner of the Baiyue brothel, and his brother would one day find out that he was the owner of the Baiyue brothel. You should go back. I will explain this to him myself. Fan Xi's chubby cheeks trembled. He must still be afraid. He waved his hand to stop the thugs behind him from rushing into the arena. Now that things had come to a head, the respect they had for their elder brother still prevailed in the end. Deng Ziyu looked at him, bowed deeply, and then left the room. The third prince, with a childish voice, cursed, "You let him go just like that? How am I supposed to walk around the capital? How dare a mere official try to bully me?" Fan Xi sighed in his heart. He sat down absent-mindedly, and his hands unconsciously stroked the smooth surface of the Qingzhou stone table. He squinted at the girl named Si Qing'er and suddenly asked, "Where is Yen'er?" Si Qing'er was confused by the scene in front of her, and she wondered why the owner would be afraid of an official from the Overwatch Council. She was not high enough, and she did not understand the complicated background of this matter. She forced a smile and said, "Yen'er should be resting in the back of the pavilion. You want to see her now?" The 14-year-old Fan Xi's eyes were filled with a ruthlessness that only an adult should have. After a while, he made a decision and said, "Don't worry. Everything will be the same as before." In his heart, he quickly calculated how he should deal with this mess. If his father knew about this, he would beat him to death. Of course, his mother loved him, and she could even persuade Igui Pin, who was in the palace, to speak to his brother. But his brother, alas, did not even give face to the eldest princess. How could he be persuaded by Igui Pin? Suddenly, his heart jumped, and his face lit up with joy. It looked like he would have to beg his sister and sister-in-law. If they spoke, his brother would not punish him too harshly. "I have business to attend to, so I will leave now." Fan Xi coldly stared at the third prince. He knew that there was something strange going on. Although he was young, he was a strong man who was willing to cut his own wrists. He coldly said, "I will not come to this place in the future, and I do not care about the profits. But I want you to calculate my share in 3 months." The third prince scratched his head and laughed. "You have second brother and your future brother-in-law to support you? What are you afraid of?" Fan Xi ignored him, and his eyes were filled with hatred. He told Si Qing, "Send the 10,000 taels of silver to the other party immediately. Who knows, it might even save your life." Si Qing'er nodded in agreement. She finally understood that she had offended someone she should not have. In the private room on the 3rd floor of Baiyue brothel that was next to the lake, Fan Xian's eyes were still looking at the boats, birds, and people on the lake. His fingers gently tapped on the table. His face was calm as he calculated this matter. Without spending much energy, he had already sorted out all the clues. Since the owners of this brothel were Fan Xi and the third prince, the capital government would not investigate it. The Overwatch Council, for Fan Xian's sake, would not make things difficult for them. Perhaps the people in the first bureau still suspected that the owner of this brothel was Fan Xian, so they would not dare to tell on him. It was fortunate that Mu Tai was brave enough to bring this up in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian gave a wry smile and drank all the wine in his cup. Fan Xi's behavior had been strange lately, and, as the older brother, he had not paid enough attention to him. He had scolded Ro and won her for no reason. He had not thought that in this world where men were superior to women, if Fan Xi wanted to do something bad outside of the manor, how could they, as a sister and sister-in-law, interfere? As for the second prince's plans, Fan Xian was very clear. In the spring, his relationship with the second prince was not bad. Back then, the second prince had used the third prince and Fan Xi to do this shady business. One, he wanted to earn more money, and the other, he did not necessarily want to do anything to the Fan Manor. He simply wanted to use this little brothel to make the relationship between the two parties closer. The reason why he hid it from Fan Xian was because the second prince thought he was doing him a favor. In his previous life, there was the true meaning of a prostitute. What kind of relationship was it to open a brothel and greet a customer? If the two parties had such a deep relationship, it would not be easy to separate them. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, there had been a subtle change. It seemed that the second prince was surprised by this, too. In the current situation, the Baoyu brothel, which was supposed to be used to deepen the relationship between the two parties, had become a rope that was forcefully twisted. If Fan Xian wanted to continue to touch the second prince, he would have to consider the existence of the Baoyu brothel. After all, Fan Xija had played a very dishonorable role in it. Based on the evidence the Overwatch Council had found, it was enough to close down the brothel and charge Fan Xija with a heavy crime. If this matter was exposed, even if the Fan family could escape the laws of the Qin Kingdom, this would become a weakness for their enemies to attack. For Fan Xian and the Fan family, it would be difficult for them to bear the consequences. For Fan Xian, he was able to stand independently in the political arena. He knew that aside from his mysterious past, the reputation he had gained over the past 2 years was also an important factor. The Fan family and the third prince were working together to open a brothel. The other party had unabashedly poured dirty water on each other at the same time. As the saying goes, one prospers, one suffers, one suffers. One is beautiful, one is dirty. Fan Xian, who had always been a free and easy poet, was now worried. He could not care less about his own reputation, but he had to care about Fan Xija's fate and his father's attitude. Chun Pingping had emphasized many times that he owed his father a lot. And from the looks of it, this matter was not difficult to solve. All he had to do was show some kindness, and the Baoyu brothel would be completely covered up in the capital. He would have enough time to deal with Fan Xija's connection to this matter. All he had to do was reach out his hand and shake it. This seemed to be the simplest and most beneficial choice for both parties. But Fan Xian would not choose to shake hands with the second prince's outstretched black hand. Even if this hand represented peace, showed enough sincerity, and was careful enough in its posture, it was full of probing and did not carry out any real provocation. This was because he could tolerate someone using his reputation to threaten him, but he could not tolerate someone using his brother to threaten him. No matter how resourceful the second prince was, he still overlooked a very important point. He was always used to judging things from the perspective of profit. He judged Fan Xian from the perspective of a court official. He forgot that there were many things that had long exceeded the scope of profit and loss, and Fan Xian was much more arrogant than a so-called official. Deng Zi had already safely boarded the carriage and left the Baoyu brothel. Fan Xian felt a little comforted. His brother was not so bad that he could not be saved. He silently put his hands behind his back and pushed open the door. He walked to the door of the room and gently pushed it open. He looked at the surprised people in the room and looked at the shocked and scared Fan Xija. His face was expressionless, and he quietly said, "Come home with me." Chapter 290. The Baoyu brothel guard outside the door had already fainted. Fan Xian stood alone in the doorway, looking emotionlessly at his 14-year-old brother. At this point, the thugs and young men in the room came to their senses. Some of them did not know who Fan Xian was, and their faces showed signs of nervousness. The young man with the injured right hand recognized him as Mr. Chun from last night. He screamed and brought a few men with him, ready to rush forward. Fan Xija did not have time to think. He turned his hand around and smashed the teapot in his hand. It was a loud bang. The first thug to pass by Fan Xija received a heavy blow to the head. He grunted and fell to the ground. His head began to bleed. The teapot in Fan Xija's hand broke, and the steaming hot tea splashed all over his hand. On the floor, the man's body began to emit a white steam. His eyes looked at the doorway in fear. His right hand, which was holding the half-broken teapot, could not help but tremble. Even the tone of his voice changed. "Big brother, why are you here?" Fan Xian did not answer him, but the people in the room were all shocked. How could the big boss knock out his own man? Everyone looked at Fan Xija in shock. Only the young third prince looked at Fan Xian with an innocent look of confusion. Some of the more quick-witted people finally remembered what he had called Fan Xian, and from that, they knew who Fan Xian was. The reason the Bayou brothel dared to be so arrogant was because of the big boss's big brother, Commissioner Fan of the Overwatch Council. Could it be that the young man in front of the door was Fan Xian's backer? Fan Xian? Fan Xian did not have the self-awareness of being the backer of a brothel. He looked down and asked, "Are we going back?" Fan Xia did not have time to think about what was about to happen to him. He gritted his teeth, and the fat on his cheeks trembled. After a while, he said, "Yes." He lowered his head and walked over to Fan Xian's side. He looked like a child who had done something wrong. Fan Xian tilted his head and looked at his little brother. He noticed that the little guy had grown quite a bit over the past 2 years. He was almost at the base of his ears. He sighed and coldly said, "First, you did something wrong. Second, you're not a child. So, do not pretend to be pitiful in front of me." "Yes." Fan Xia groaned. Fan Xian ignored him. His cold gaze swept over the dozen or so people in the room. He found that some of them were the nobles who had appeared the night before. They had escaped, so Fan Xian had not broken their bones with his bare hands. He narrowed his eyes and found that there were a few faces that he could still recognize. He had a good memory, although the other party did not have the ability to recognize him. Since they already knew his identity, he could only humbly step forward and bow. "Greetings, big cousin." "Greetings, uncle." "Grandpa Xian." The major and minor shareholders of the Bayou brothel walked up to Fan Xian in a pitiful manner and greeted him. Hearing these people introduce themselves, Fan Xian's heart was filled with anger and self-mockery. What the F***ck was going on? Investigating a case had led to the discovery of his own face. No wonder Sang when said that carriages often came from Minister Alley. The people in front of him were all related to him. If they were not from the Fan family, then they were related to the Liu family. Fan Xia and the third prince were the leaders of this brothel. They had opened this brothel, so naturally these people were related. He shook his head, and his chest was filled with anger. He wanted to throw these people, who he did not know where they had come from, into the thin lake behind the brothel. After a while, he suppressed the anger in his heart. He grabbed Fan Xia by the collar like he was carrying a little chick and walked out of the secret room of the Bayou brothel. Just as the two brothers were about to walk out of the room with flagging interest, the third prince seemed to have just come back to his senses. Revealing a sweet smile, he said with pleasant surprise, "Sir Fan Jr." "Oh, cousin." Fan Xian turned around and looked at the youngest prince. A gentle smile appeared on his face, and he said, "Third prince, don't ever try to act like a little kid in front of me. Also, I have no interest in talking to a little kid like you." Everyone was shocked. To call a prince a little kid in public? Fan Xian was the first person since the founding of the Qin Kingdom. Everyone was shocked by Fan Xian's boldness, but they were also confused. No matter how much the emperor loved him, he was still an official. How could he be so disrespectful to a prince? The third prince stared at Fan Xian, and his lips trembled with anger. Fan Xian's smile was even sweeter, and he said, "That little mouth of yours is trembling." The third prince almost fainted from anger, but he remembered what his mother had said. When this big cousin smiled gently, it was when he was very unhappy. It was best not to provoke him. He gritted his teeth and did not say anything. It was in the afternoon, and there were not many customers in the Bayou brothel. News of what happened upstairs had already spread, and many people rushed to the first floor. They were fortunate enough to see the eldest brother scold his son. At this time, everyone who knew the inside story knew that Mr. Chun, who had caused such a ruckus in the Bayou brothel last night, was the famous young master Fan. Naturally, no one dared to step forward and cause trouble. They could only watch. The thugs and girls, who did not know what was going on, could not help but whisper to each other. There was a glimmer of excitement in their eyes, and they spread the news they had just received. Could it be that the little fatty, who was being held like a chicken, was the most mysterious boss of their brothel? No matter how they looked at him, he did not look like the vicious character that was rumored to be. And who was the beautiful young man holding the boss? Fan Xian walked forward, holding the boss of the Bayou brothel. His face was expressionless, but he saw the girl named Yen in the corner. Her eyes seemed to be worried. He raised his eyebrows, and his heart was moved. He knew that this matter had gotten out of hand, and he could not hide it from the people of the capital for long. But he did not intend to hide it. He had other plans. Walking out of the door of the Bayou brothel, there was a carriage on each side of the quiet street. Fan Xian's carriage was on the west side, and the carriage on the east side had no markings. But the curtain was lifted, and Crown Prince Hong Chung revealed an apologetic face. His face had long since lost its usual brightness, and he greeted Fan Xian. The sun was moving toward the west, and the dusky light made one feel uncomfortable. It shone through the leaves of the autumn trees, and it shone on Fan Xian's face. He seemed to be pierced by the sun, and he squinted his eyes in annoyance. Tung Zijing appeared out of nowhere, and he said, "The master knows that the young master has something to discuss, and so he asked me to take the second young master back." Fan Xian did not turn around, and he nodded slightly. He then said, "In a moment, there will be people from the clan entering the manor. Tell the guards in the house to be on high alert. Do not let a single one of them slip out." He then looked at Fan Xizha, whose face was pale, and said, "If anyone dares to sneak out again, I will break their legs." Although his words were soft, they made those who heard them shudder. Tung Zijing could clearly feel the anger in the young master's heart, and he did not dare to be careless. He respectfully replied, "The master has spoken. You will deal with this matter yourself, young master. The manor will be closed today, and we will await your return." Fan Xian nodded and walked toward Crown Prince Hongqing's carriage. Fan Xizha cried out "brother" behind him, but he received no response. He could only obediently get into the carriage. The two parties beside the carriage did not seem to be in the middle of some kind of negotiation or peace negotiation, but more like they were chatting. Fan Xian laughed lightly. "Why are you in such a hurry to take Miss Yuan back to the Jinghe River?" Hongqing laughed bitterly. "I didn't think Yuan Meng's matter could be hidden from you." Fan Xian replied, "You know what I do for a living. It's difficult to hide something like this from me." Li Hongchang moved slightly to the side and invited him into the carriage. Fan Xian shook his head, and then he saw that in the spacious carriage, besides the well-endowed Yuan Meng, there was another person sitting there. That noble person was half squatting on the seat, looking at Fan Xian with a warm and sincere gaze. Fan Xian's pupils shrank, but he immediately returned to normal. He smiled and cupped his hands in salute. "Greetings, Your Highness. Back in the spring, we weren't so distant." The second prince's thin lips moved slightly, and there was a look of pity in his clear eyes. He slowly said, "How did you suddenly become like this?" Fan Xian laughed. "Perhaps I don't know how to appreciate favors." The second prince was silent for a moment. After a while, he said, "This is not a good place to talk. Master Fan, would it be possible for us to talk in detail?" Fan Xian's smile faded, and he shook his head. "I'm in a hurry to go home and deal with that useless child of mine. I don't have time. I'm just passing by." The second prince smiled at Fan Xian and said something that neither of them would believe. Whether or not the Bayou brothel case was investigated had nothing to do with him. If Fan Xian wanted to investigate it, the Fan family would lose face and profit. If he did not investigate it, then that would be the best outcome. Everyone would be eating from the same bowl, and the Fan family would have to be more tolerant of him in the future when it came to politics. Although the second prince saw that the palace treasury was on the brink of collapse, he cared a great deal about the money that the brothel brought. But compared to whether or not he could win over Fan Xian, money was a small matter. Fan Xian sighed and said, "Investigating a case has led to my own family, and I've let the second prince watch a good show. What a joke." The second prince shook his head and sighed. "I can't laugh. The Bayou brothel's business is too complicated. Although I didn't get involved, I know that aside from the third prince, at least 70% of the shares are in the hands of Fan Xizha. You are brothers, after all. If you can't, then let it go." The two of them were talking about something else, and they both knew what they were talking about. Where did he get the money to be a big boss? Fan Xian shook his head and smiled wryly. Hong Yigong's two grandsons also paid a lot of money. The second prince seemed to be kind enough to remind Fan Xian. Hong Yigong was in the Lu Manor. Fan Xian pretended to be surprised, and then sadly said, It looks like we will have to stop investigating this case. The second prince knew that not investigating the case meant that Fan Xian was willing to make peace for the time being. He was happy, and the smile on his face was very genuine. He said, "Although everyone's status is different, we are all poor people who live in the capital. You are an important person in the manor, and you have to make decisions for your children." Fan Xian said, "I won't lie to you, Your Highness. I am not a pure official who is loyal to the law." He looked straight into the second prince's eyes and said, "Besides, Your Highness has calculated all the details. How can I not give in?" The second prince was shocked. He knew that Fan Xian was not a person who would show weakness. As expected, Fan Xian clapped his hands, expressionless. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the Baiwa brothel behind the carriage. There was the sound of people and horses tumbling, tables and chairs falling to the ground, and the terrified screams of the girls in the brothel. Li Hongqing's face changed. He didn't know how many people Fan Xian had arranged for the first bureau of the Overwatch Council to be placed in the Baiwa brothel. His face was full of worry, and he said, "Enji, to be honest, even if you make this a hard case, you can't hurt us. Why go through all this trouble?" Hongqing was a very direct person, Fan Xian thought, and a self-mocking look flashed in his eyes. Seeing that he was still 1,000 miles away, no matter how much self-control the second prince had, his heart gradually grew cold. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "It is just some children's business. Xia and the third prince had nothing to do, so they set up a brothel to play. Don't take it too seriously." Fan Xian knew that the business of the Baoyu house was far from enough to deal a blow to a prince. Furthermore, the handsome second prince in front of him had nothing to do with this brothel. If he started with Yuan Meng, he would only be able to get Hongqing involved. If he really wanted to investigate further, he would only end up hurting his own hand. "Xia is my little brother. I will think about how to discipline him." He looked back at the second prince. "But you have to discipline your own brother." Hongqing finally couldn't help but shake his head and say, "Enji, you must not misunderstand this. The business of the Baiwa brothel was indeed done by those two kids. I know Yuan Meng came to help, but the second prince and I did not interfere." Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Sometimes, not interfering and just watching is a very clever move." He looked at Hongqing with a not-quite-there smile and said, "And I do not believe Fan Xia has the ability to investigate the relationship between you and Yuan Meng." The raid continued, and the Baiwa brothel was still in a state of chaos. The second prince frowned and thought, is Fan Xian really so cold-hearted? To protect his own reputation and attack him, Fan Xian didn't even care about the life and death of his own brother and his family. Fan Xian guessed what he was thinking, and with a self-mocking expression, he looked at the second prince and said, "Your Highness, your calculations are flawless. I do not dare investigate the Baiwa brothel. After all, I cannot personally send Fan Xia to the capital government." As long as the two sides could maintain their current peace, then the Fan and Lu families, as well as the people involved in the Baiwa brothel, would not have to face the pressure of the capital government. Even Fan Xian himself thought the second prince had played a beautiful hand. The price he asked for was not too high. After a long time, Fan Xian looked at Mu Feng, who was far away, making a secret gesture. He knew he had not copied out the account books of the Baiwa brothel, but he never expected to do so. Fan Xia, that little rascal, was being blackmailed by the second prince. Fan Xia only knew how to be an unscrupulous businessman, but he did not know that the buttocks of a businessman were always being watched by officials. The second prince finally understood what Fan Xian wanted to do. He smiled and thought, Fan Xia was the owner of the Baiwa brothel, and there is no way Fan Xian can clear his name. The Fan and Lu families are both caught up in this. If you do not want to make a big deal out of this, you will have to make peace with yourself. The Baiwa brothel will continue to operate. Fan Xian continued to speak calmly. Your Highness, you should understand what I mean. The second prince nodded to show his agreement, but deep in his heart, he felt a strong sense of unease. He knew that Fan Xian was not easy to control, and he would not allow himself to be tied down by a brothel. He did not know what Fan Xian would do next. Fan Xian's tone changed, and he said, "Hong Chung, this is not right. You were sleeping outside, and I did not have the heart to tell Ruruo about it. I hoped that after your marriage, you would be more restrained. But how could you know that Xijia was doing such a shady business, and yet you did not tell us? Even if I was not in the capital at the time, could you not have told Ruruo? After all, in a few days, you will be Xijia's brother-in-law." He looked at the prince and said, "Hong Chung, you have disappointed me." The second prince was silent. No matter how smart he was, there was no way he could detect the hidden meaning behind Fan Xian's words. Even Li Hongsheng felt guilty. He did not know what Fan Xian was planning to do with this incident, or what ulterior motives he had to achieve. The search of the Baoyue brothel continued, and the second prince thought, if you have agreed to make peace, why do you still want to search? He was worried that the black dogs of the Overwatch Council would discover the relationship between Hongsheng and the brothel, and so he frowned and said, "Mr. Fan, can you tell your men to stop? After all, this is the business of the capital government. The Overwatch Council interfering with government affairs is something that the Emperor has forbidden." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Your Highness, I'm only following orders from my family to come to this brothel and take back a few of my useless relatives. Of course, I have used the men of the First Bureau, which is a private use. But the officials of the court often call on their subordinates to help them move houses, and my subordinates only know how to fight. Asking them to help me capture a few of my relatives is not a big deal." The second prince was angry. Fan Xian had used the word relative, and he did not know what to say. In the Baoyue brothel behind the carriages, the noise gradually died down. The disguised officers of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council pulled out 7 or 8 people. These people were all relatives of the Fan and Lu families, and they were deeply involved in the Baoyue brothel. Their faces looked defeated. At the very back of the group, there was a young man with a vicious face. He had been beaten down the stairs, and his body was covered in wounds. It was the young man who had wanted to kill Fan Xian the night before. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and gazed at his terrified relatives. Through gritted teeth, he said coldly, "Send them back to the manor." He turned to the second prince and softly said, "Do not worry, Your Highness. What I promised you, I will do. But these people are mine. It is not convenient to use the laws of the Qin Kingdom to investigate them, so I will have to use the family rules to deal with them." The second prince thought to himself, no matter how you use the family rules, you cannot hide the fact that the Fan family owns the shares of the Baoyue brothel. You will not have a falling out with me, and I will let you vent your anger on your own. The second prince looked at the people of the Fan and Lu families, and his heart trembled. He did not know what kind of family rules Fan Xian was going to use to deal with them. Fan Xian looked into his eyes and suddenly said, "The people who ambushed me last night, I would like to trouble you to pass on a message. From now on the streets of the capital, do not let me see them again. Yes, that is all." Chapter 291. The First Bureau of the Overwatch Council dealt with the looting of the building very appropriately. They only arrested those who were related to the Fan and Lu families. The little bastards from the Duke's Manor had been beaten by Fan Xian and had been sent home to recover from their wounds. They also did not have a right to get too involved, so none of them were arrested. After Uncle Mu and Uncle Mu had arrested the people, they did not say anything to Commissioner Fan, who was standing next to the carriage. They took the young men back to Fan Manor. The people of the Overwatch Council saw Fan Xian stand outside the carriage for a long time and did not go in. The people in the carriage did not come out either, and they knew that the person in the carriage was someone more important than Fan Xian. Fan Xian was a member of the royal family, so the person in the carriage must be someone close to the royal family. The looting of the building did not yield any results. Fan Xian wanted to destroy the accounts of Fan Xijia and the Baoyue brothel, but that was an impossible task. Because of this, he was forced to maintain a temporary peace with the second prince. Investigating the Baoyue brothel was a stupid thing to do. The people of the Overwatch Council left, and the people of the capital government came to keep the peace. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. The Fan and Liu families still owned 70% of the shares of the Baoyu brothel, and they continued to be the infamous prostitutes of the capital. Commissioner Fan and the second prince were having a very intimate conversation. It seemed that the capital was about to be at peace. The second prince, who was in the carriage, looked at Fan Xian's calm face, and he could not help but feel a little admiration for him. What happened with the Baoyu brothel was enough to make most people angry, but Fan Xian was calm. He accepted his suggestion of peace without any hesitation. He was a very good judge of the situation, and he was brave enough to make decisions. Every time he saw that familiar smile on Fan Xian's face, he felt a sense of unease and familiarity in the depths of his heart. He always felt that Fan Xian was someone very similar to himself. Although Fan Xian was an official, he still had a strong urge to have a deep conversation with him. Hongshan, you go first. I have some private things to discuss with Mr. Fan, the second prince said coldly. He paid no attention to the eyes of the people on the street and slowly walked down from the carriage. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. He was surprised by the other party's action. Just now, he had clearly said that he was going back to the manor and did not want to have a deep conversation. However, the other party was a prince and had personally come out of the carriage to invite him. Even if he was not giving him face, he still wanted to hear what he wanted to say. So he gently nodded. Li Hongsheng looked at him apologetically. He and the carriage left the Baoyu brothel, a place of trouble. The second prince's embroidered shoes stepped onto the street. He couldn't resist stretching. Amidst the whispers of the crowd in the distance, he led Fan Xian into a tea shop. A servant had already cleared the tea shop. Only he and Fan Xian sat facing each other. Fan Xian picked up the bowl and took a sip. He raised his eyebrows in surprise and glanced at the second prince. The second prince smiled and said, I know you like this. Every time you go to Hongshan Manor, you ask for some sour berries to drink. He then warmly said, Brother Fan must hate me for what happened at the Baoyu brothel. Fan Xian slightly raised his lips and said, I am not a saint. Naturally, I have emotions. The second prince shook his head and said, In the beginning, when your second brother and my third brother discussed doing business, I already knew about it. I even secretly helped. He looked at Fan Xian's face and said, But do not misunderstand. At that time, the court and the capital all thought the Fan family was on good terms with me. I did not have the intention to threaten you. I only wanted to find a place of mutual benefit for both sides and make our relationship closer. Who would have thought that it would become a dirty trick? It was not what I wanted. Fan Xian had already guessed the second prince's thoughts when he built the Baoyu brothel in the spring, so he was not surprised. But hearing him admit to using dirty tricks, he did not know how to respond. He smiled and said, Your Highness, you really do have a lot of respect for me. The second prince was not afraid to continue this topic. He lightly said, I have always valued you. You should know that. So, I do not understand why, after you return to the capital, you would target me. Fan Xian smiled and said, Your Highness's words are a bit muddled. I'm only an official. What good would it do me to target your Highness? The second prince stared into his eyes and slowly said, I need you to tell me. I know, you would not be willing to be a pawn of the crown prince, so I really do not understand. He had not thought that this prince would be so open and honest. Fan Xian felt a bit surprised. Shortly after, a clear smile rose to his face. He quietly said, Your Highness, you really do not understand? The second prince looked into his eyes and gently shook his head. Fan Xian slightly tilted his head and used his knuckles to knock on the surface of the wooden table. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, Niulan Street. The second prince was silent. A moment later, he said, This is my fault. Having said this, he stood up and bowed deeply toward Fan Xian. As the emperor's own son, he bowed and apologized to an official. Fan Xian did not show the expression that the second prince had hoped to see. He sat on the chair like a piece of ice, squinting at him. Your Highness is your Highness, he said quietly. An official is an official. This is a matter of life and death. Perhaps your highness thinks that by personally apologizing, you have already given me enough of an explanation, and that I, as an official, should be moved to tears and feel a sense of belonging to the nation. The second prince took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger that had not appeared in his heart for many years. He coldly said, "Then, Master Fan, how can you repair the relationship between us?" Fan Xian suddenly laughed and said, "Actually, in the last round of investigation, you know why. Who told my mother-in-law to always dislike me as a son-in-law? One moment, he was an assassin. The next, he was from the Imperial Censorate. And next year, I will be taking over the palace treasury. I cannot avoid conflict with Xinjiang. If your highness is willing to promise me one thing, I cannot guarantee that I will be biased, but at least in the capital, I will have the Overwatch Council maintain a relatively fair attitude." The second prince's heart trembled slightly. The sliver of negative emotion that had been lingering in his chest earlier had long disappeared. During these few months, his people and officials in court had been closely watched by the Overwatch Council, including the Imperial Astronomer and the others. They had all met with great misfortune, giving the entire second prince's faction a headache. Now that he heard Fan Xian say that he could change the Overwatch Council's attitude, how could he not be tempted? After a moment of silence, he stretched out his right hand and very gently said, "Please speak, Commissioner." This sentence used an official title. Fan Xian looked at him and smiled. "Your Highness, if you can keep your distance from the eldest princess, I promise you a lifetime of peace." The second prince was startled. He had never thought that Fan Xian would make such an absurd suggestion. Promise him a lifetime of peace? How arrogant and daring. He finally couldn't hold back his depression. In a cold voice, he said, "Commissioner Fan, are you playing with me?" The two young nobles, who did not actually look alike, but their temperaments and auras were very similar, sat across from each other at a table and did not see eye to eye. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Your Highness has many questions, and I also have many questions. Is this dragon chair really so easy to sit on? Is peace not a rare blessing? Your Highness has always liked literature, and Lady Shu is also a clear-minded person like Snow. How can you not see through the crux of this?" Even though there was no one in the tea shop at this moment, and there was no need to worry that this conversation would be overheard by others, suddenly hearing Fan Xian speak his mind so plainly, the second prince's heart still trembled uncontrollably. There were many things in this world that could only be done and not said. For example, no matter how much he wanted to take the throne, he was still incomparably respectful to the crown prince. Who would have thought that this person in front of him would say it so lightly? It was not until today that the second prince truly understood the extent of Fan Xian's courage. He also became more and more unclear as to what Fan Xian was relying on. A dim light flashed through the second prince's eyes. This dim light was touched by Fan Xian's words. Years of pain finally began to burn. Staring at Fan Xian's face, he lowered his voice and said coldly, "Everyone knows that the dragon chair is not easy to sit on. But I am in the Emperor's home, and I have no choice. If I want to take this chair, I can take it. If I don't want it, I still have to take it. If I have the freedom to choose, I would rather go to the Imperial College and study every day than get mixed up in this matter." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly. "Is someone forcing you?" Perhaps Fan Xian's boldness had aroused a trace of bloodlust, and the second prince laughed coldly. "Of course someone is forcing me. From the time I was 12, they said that I was virtuous and that it would be a waste to be a prince. When I was 13, they made me a king. When I was 14, they built a manor outside the palace. On the surface, it seemed like they were chasing me out of the palace, but in reality, they gave me the opportunity to freely submit to the officials. When I was 15, they let me enter the royal study to listen to state affairs. Did you know? Before me, only the crown prince had such an opportunity." The second prince's handsome face gradually twisted. "I don't want to fight, but these things are coming out one by one. What can I do? Does the Eastern Palace think that I don't want to fight for the throne?" The crown prince was young at the time, but he looked at me with such hatred in his eyes. We are brothers. When he was only 13, he already wanted to kill me. Even if I can convince the crown prince, what about the empress? Will she let me go? Fan Xian was silent, listening to the second prince's madness. It was he who pushed me into this position. The second prince's eyes were like a cold fire sealed in ice, making people shiver. I want to protect my mother. I want to protect my life. What should I do? Since you want me to fight, then I'll fight for him. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. He knew that the only one who had the power to force a prince onto the road of fighting for the throne was the emperor himself. He smiled slightly and said, "But have you ever thought that maybe he is just using you as a stone, a whetstone to force the crown prince to mature?" I knew that a long time ago. The second prince coldly waved his sleeve. "We are both favored by the heavens. Who would be willing to be a whetstone that will break in the future? So, I have to keep fighting. If I really do win, I will be happier to see him regret than sitting on that chair." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Why vent your resentment on such a matter? The great prince has already been made a prince, but he seems to know a lot more than the second prince. If someone wants to push you into the river to compete in swimming, your best resistance is to fight to the death and not enter the river. At most, you can turn around and fight with the person behind you. It's not to go into the river and strangle your opponent to death." The second prince finally calmed down. He looked at Fan Xian with shock. "Your words sound like rebellion." Fan Xian shook his head indifferently. "The treasonous things your highness said today are no less than mine." The second prince's eyebrows suddenly jumped. He looked at Fan Xian. A moment later, he suddenly said, "Help me, Fan Xian." Fan Xian shook his head calmly, even coldly. "Why?" The second prince quietly said, "In the future, you will have to choose someone." Fan Xian did not answer him. He only thought, based on blood relations, this person in front of him should be his brother. He was different from other officials. He did not want to make a choice. He was just a little shocked by the Qing kingdom's ruthless way of teaching, and he gradually grew afraid. Seeing the second prince's sincere gaze, Fan Xian finally opened his mouth and said, "Do not get too close to Xinyan. That woman is a very talented madwoman. I don't know what she is thinking." The second prince calmed down. He smiled and sat down. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew that although the second prince was tempted by his power, he still trusted the eldest princess's power more. But this was good. At least in the future, when he was dealing with the second prince in front of him, his heart would be a little harder. "I still don't want to be your enemy," the second prince said seriously. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He suddenly raised his head and said, "Even if the Baluweb brothel incident did not happen, I would still beat you down to the ground." A mocking look flashed through the second prince's eyes. It seemed that he thought Fan Xian's arrogance had gone too far. Fan Xian ignored his look and coldly said, "Perhaps this is the only way for you and Hongsheng to survive." The second prince heard the pity and disdain in Fan Xian's voice, and he was furious. He suddenly stood up and stared coldly into Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian mockingly said, "Your Highness, do not ever think that you can control everything. That includes the Baluwa brothel." The atmosphere in the tea shop suddenly became cold. 8 people slowly walked in from outside the shop. They were all wearing the same clothes, but it was impossible to tell how old they were. Every single one of them had a murderous aura hidden deep within their bodies. Some were like a knife, some were like a sword, and some were like a giant axe that could split open a mountain. Fan Xian knew that the second prince would not choose to kill him in the busy market. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the 8 people who had walked into the tea shop from who knew where. In a quiet voice, he said, "The 4 generals gone, Liu, Xie, and Fan. The 4 gentlemen He, Zhang, Su, and Chao, the legendary 8 generals under the second prince's command. So this is what they look like." The second prince looked at him and said, "Fan Xian, I value you, but that does not mean I must need you. So, do not be too arrogant." Fan Xian stood up and smiled as he waved his hand. He said, "The Qinian unit under my command cannot beat the 8 people under your command, so I will not make a fool of myself. But there is something that I must say. Your Highness, no matter how many people you have, it is useless for the bigger picture. Otherwise, Qin Pingping would have become emperor a long time ago." Amidst his laughter, he threw down his last rebellious sentence and left the tea house in a carefree manner. When he walked out of the shop, he seemed to casually pass through the 8 most capable family warriors of the second prince. He only slightly shrugged his shoulders in front of the Gon and Xie generals and waved his hand in front of the Su and Chao princes. A faint breath of air came into contact with the murderous aura of the 8 people that had yet to be released. In an instant, it spread along the wooden pillars of the tea shop and mixed with the autumn afternoon sunlight outside the tea shop. There was no trace of it anymore. A moment after Fan Xian left, the second prince rested his chin on the table and furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't know why he had suddenly lost his composure in front of Fan Xian and said many things that had been hidden in the depths of his heart. He took a deep breath, and a glimmer of seriousness flashed across his handsome face. In a cold voice, he said, "If there's a day in the future when you need to kill him, how many people do you need?" Xiebian slowly put the sheathed sword back in his white sleeve and said woodenly, "I alone will be enough." Fan Wuzhou's face was dark, and he shook his head slightly. He said, "Even if the 8 generals were to come together, they might not be able to keep Sir Fan Jr." The second prince was a little lost in thought. He thought that even the 8 generals did not care about Fan Xian's words. This Fan Xian was a character that he could not see through. But then he remembered that after the Baiwa brothel incident, Fan Xian would not make a move against him for a while. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian carefully used water to wash away the faint fragrance that remained on his fingers. He was a little disappointed with the conversation. Although he had taken a great risk to draw out some of the second prince's thoughts, there was no useful information. He still did not understand the arrangements between him and the eldest princess. It looked like the second prince was a person with a calm mind and a scholarly spirit. But he was not a caring sister, so there was no point in knowing these things. The carriage arrived at Fan Manor. He jumped down from the carriage and calmly walked through the corner door. He quickly walked to the back garden, ignoring the confused faces of the Fan and Lu family members. He went straight to the study room, pushed open the door with his steady hands, and then kicked it open. Inside the study room, there was a scream. Under the horrified gazes of the entire family, Fan Xia, who had no idea what had happened, was kicked into a ball and smashed into the armchair, breaking it into several pieces. Chapter 292. Fan Manor was now divided into 2 residences, one front and one back. The courtyard was luxurious, and the house was spacious. There were 3 study rooms, and the one where the scream had come from was on the west side, next to the garden. It was the least guarded of the 3, and it was also the one the servants were closest to. The sudden scream, like that of a pig being slaughtered, shocked everyone in the garden. After Fan Xia's scream, 2 women's screams immediately rang out in the study room. Fan Ro and Lin Wan Er's faces lost all color. They stepped forward and grabbed Fan Xian's arm, afraid that their husband or brother would get angry and kick Fan Xia to death. In the eyes of these 2 women, Fan Xian had always been a gentle, refined, mature, and steady young man. Even though there were times when he was unhappy, he had never shown such a violent side. Seeing the frost on Fan Xian's face, the 2 women couldn't help but shiver. They didn't know what Fan Xia had done to make him so angry, but they still held on to Fan Xian's arm, not letting him step forward. After Fan Xia had been dragged back to Fan Manor by Teng Zijing, he was as anxious as a cat on a hot tin roof. With great difficulty, he finally found an empty spot. He begged Cici, who was passing by the study room, to secretly send a message to his sister-in-law and sister, asking them to come quickly. Fan Ro and Lin didn't know what had happened. After entering the study room, they heard Fan Xia's cries for help, and even joked with him a little. Now, seeing Fan Xian's vicious kick to the heart, they knew that things had gotten out of hand. Their faces paled, and they looked at Fan Xian's angry face with a hint of fear. "Let go." The words that came out of Fan Xian's mouth seemed to have been soaked in ice for an entire night. They were cold and carried with them a cold wind. "Father already knows of this matter. No one can stop me. I won't beat him to death," Fantasia lay on the ground, pretending to be dead. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that his brother's expression was calm and that he wouldn't kill him. He let out a sigh of relief. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian continued coldly, "I'm going to cripple him." As he spoke, he easily extricated himself from the two girls' tight grip. In his anger, he didn't have time to find the family rules. He directly grabbed the teacup on the desk and threw it at Fantasia's face. With a loud crash, the teacup smashed right next to Fantasia's head. Hot tea and broken porcelain splattered everywhere. Fantasia cried out in pain as his face was scratched with blood. He no longer dared to lie on the ground and pretend to be dead. He jumped up and hid behind Warner, crying and howling, "Sister-in-law, brother wants to kill me. Help!" Lin Warner looked at the blood on her brother-in-law's face and jumped in fright. She quickly shielded him behind her and blocked the angry Fan Xian in front of her. She hurriedly said, "What happened? What was going on? Can't we talk things out?" Fan Xian looked at Fantasia's sorry state, hiding behind Warner, but he didn't soften at all. Thinking of all the dirty things Fantasia had done, he became even angrier. He pointed at him and scolded. "Ask him what he did." Fantasia was about to open his mouth to explain, but he felt a sweetness in his chest. He almost spat out blood. He knew how hard his brother's kick had been, and for a moment, he was scared half to death. He didn't know if he was going to die like that. In his terror, he gathered his courage and jumped up. He screamed, "I just opened a brothel. Is there a need to be so desperate? Sister-in-law, I can't live, ah!" After letting out a blood-curdling scream, Fantasia fell to the ground. Warner and Ro were shocked. They quickly squatted down, rubbed their chests, and pinched their nostrils. By this time, Fan Xian had already vented some of his anger. Seeing that the kid was pretending to be dead, he was so angry that he laughed. He then looked at the open door of the study. There were servants in the garden watching from afar. He closed the door behind him and said expressionlessly, "That kick didn't kill you. Get up." Fantasia saw that he was going to be ruthless, so he didn't dare to get up. He could only hide behind his sister-in-law and sister, hoping to stall until his mother arrived. Fan Xian had already sat behind the desk. His face was expressionless, but no one knew what he was thinking. Ruo carefully handed him a cup of tea. She asked quietly, "What brothel?" Fan Xian slowly sipped the tea in his cup. He closed his eyes and coldly said, "A brothel." Warner and Ro were shocked again. The two girls had been scared a lot today. But compared to Fan Xian's kick to the heart, Fantasia's brothel was a bit absurd, but it didn't bother them too much. In the capital, most of the children of the rich and powerful had some secret business dealings. Although it wasn't very glamorous, and Fantasia, he was young, but did he really have to be this angry? Fan Xian coldly laughed. He pulled out the Overwatch Council's investigation of the Bayou brothel. He threw it to his sister. Fan Ruro's face was full of confusion. She took it and looked at it. The file was not very long, but it clearly stated the history of the Bayou brothel. The evidence was clear, and there was no way to explain it. It took her a while to finish reading it. Her hair was a mess, and a few strands of hair fell across her forehead. It covered her face and eyes, and it was impossible to see her reaction or expression. But gradually, Ruo's breathing became heavy. It was clear that she was angry and sad. Her lower lip sank in her mouth, and it looked like she was gritting her teeth. Lin Wana watched this scene with curiosity. She wanted to know what was written on the file, and she wanted to go next to her sister-in-law to look at it. But she was afraid that Fan Xian would take advantage of her absence and beat Fantasia to death. So she didn't dare move. Fan Ro slowly raised her head. Her face was calm, but the coldness between her eyebrows was very heavy. Her calm eyes were now filled with anger. She looked at Fantasia, who was hiding behind her sister-in-law and pretending to be dead. She gritted her teeth and asked, "Did you do all of this?" The tone of her question was calm, but underneath the calm surface, there was an undercurrent that made everyone in the room feel uneasy. Fantasia had been raised by his sister since he was a child. Compared to her, he was more afraid of this seemingly weak sister. He was also closer to Ruo, Subconsciously, he slowly sat up and explained in a trembling voice, "Sister, what is it?" Fan Ruruo's face was full of sadness and disappointment. She wondered how her brother had become like this. Tears began to well up in her eyes. She gritted her teeth and threw the file at Fantasia. It landed right on Fantasia's face and said, "Look at it yourself." Fantasia looked at his brother, who was sitting calmly, and then looked at his sister-in-law. He picked up the file and continued to read. The more he read, the worse his face became. Brother knew what the Bayou brothel had done. At this time, Fancien squinted his eyes and slowly stood up from his chair. Fantasia screamed and jumped up. He waved his hands and was scared to death. He tried to explain, "Brother, I didn't do this. Don't hit me anymore." Fancien squinted his eyes and looked at his brother. He coldly said, "Murder, arson, and forcing a girl to be a prostitute. If you were the one who did this, I would have kicked you to death. But who are you? You are the owner of the Bayou brothel. Without your approval, would those bastards dare to do these things?" Fantasia's voice was trembling, and he said, "Some of these things were done by my brother. It had nothing to do with me." Fantasia. Fancien coldly laughed and said, "Ruo said you were like a pig, and she was right. Do you think you can wash yourself clean like this? I've really underestimated you. You've actually become the leader of the small tyrants in the capital. You're really capable. You are so capable." Fantasia's heart grew colder and colder. Although he was young, his mind was sharp and ruthless. He knew that his brother wouldn't listen to his explanation, so he felt more and more wronged. With a long face, he howled, "It really has nothing to do with me." Right at this moment, he saw another scene that made his soul jump out of his body. Ruoro's face was calm. She pulled out a stick that was no longer than an arm and handed it to Fancien. The first time Fancien came to the capital, Ruoro used a ruler to strike Fantasia's palm. The ruler was the Fan family's small family rule. What was the big family rule? It was a stick. It was a stick with thick thorns wrapped around it. It was a terrifying rod that could split open the flesh of the person being tortured with a single strike. In the entire Fan manor, there was only one person who was lucky enough to experience the big family rule. That person was once Count Sinan's most favored follower. He used the power of the Fan manor and Fangien's favor to cause trouble in the Ministry of Revenue. In the end, he was beaten down by Fangien with a stick. Now, he was living in a manor outside the city. His leg was broken, and he was miserable. When Fantasia was educated as a child, he had seen the man's miserable state. Now, seeing Fancien weighing the big family rule in his hand, he was scared silly. His mouth was wide open, but he couldn't say anything. Fancien walked out and coldly said to his wife, Enro, "I am responsible for this. You two cannot escape responsibility." Warner silently retreated to the side and stood next to Ruo. Fantasia saw the stick coming closer and closer to him. In his terror, he stirred up the fierceness in his bones. He jumped up and pointed at Fancien's face. "Sister-in-law, sister, don't listen to him. Brother, no. Fancien, don't act like a saint. What's wrong with me running a brothel? What's wrong with me being a tyrant? Who in the capital doesn't do the same? Why do you have to hit me? You think I don't know what you're thinking? It's just that you and the second prince don't get along, and I've dragged you in. You've lost face. So what? You want to take it out on me? You want to beat me to death?" Fantasia cried loudly. "Beat me to death if you have the guts. What kind of brother are you? When I was doing business, how could I have known that you would fall out with the second prince? What does that have to do with me? You never told me. If you have the guts, then go beat up the third prince. You only know how to bully someone like me, who doesn't have a mother or father to care for him. What kind of guts are you? Aren't you the commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Go catch the capital's magistrate and beat up the third prince in the palace. Go, go." It was a light slap. Fantasia's face had been slapped, which wasn't very loud. He woke up and looked at Fancien, who was getting closer and closer. After Fancien heard this nonsense, he was angry. Although he didn't show it on his face, the veins on his forehead were starting to show. In the 20 years since he was reborn, this was the first time he had been so angry. Most importantly, he had truly thought of Fantasia as a brother. Who knew that he would do something like this and speak so eloquently? You shut up. He finally couldn't help but curse. If you want to do business, I'll let you do it. If you don't do evil, why would others dare to threaten me? Even if they did, am I the kind of person who would be threatened? I want to punish you today, not for anything else, but because you deserve it. This has nothing to do with the second prince in the palace, and it has nothing to do with the third prince. Fantasia, you need to understand that this is your business. Fantasia was both sad and angry. You are so young, yet you act so ruthlessly. If I don't punish you, who knows what kind of trouble you will bring to father? I have expectations for you, so I won't allow you to continue down this path. Who cares about the second prince and the third prince? I am angry at you, and I hate you. They are not my brothers. You are my brother. He stared into his brother's eyes and said coldly, I have investigated clearly. Fortunately, you were not personally involved in those matters, so you can still be saved. Since you have gone down the wrong path, I will use my stick to help you correct it. As soon as he finished speaking, the stick came down. Under the great discipline, Fantasia's trousers were torn and blood flowed everywhere. Finally, he let out a heart-wrenching howl. The sound quickly spread throughout the fan manor, startling the servants and maids in the garden, as well as Tung Zijing and Deng Ziyu subordinates. It also frightened the children of the Fan and Lu families who were waiting in the garden. Naturally, it also made some people feel incomparably distressed. The screams of the second young master of the Fan family reverberated throughout the garden. The sound was so shrill that no one could bear to hear it. Earlier, it had been accompanied by Fantasia's fierce resistance. Later, it became a cry for mercy. Then, it became a pitiful cry for help. Finally, the voice gradually became softer. Amidst the weak cries, one could hear the 14-year-old calling for his mother. Master, Cija is really going to be beaten to death. Lucia knelt in front of Minister Fan, her face streaked with tears, and hugged his legs. Go and talk to Fan Xian and make him stop. This is enough of a lesson. What if he really dies? Chapter 293. The beautiful Lady Lu had always maintained an air of nobility in Fan Manor. But today, she no longer cared about her appearance or her temperament. Her face was pale, and she could not bear it. She hugged her master's legs and cried, Master, please say something. Zhe is still young. He can't take such a beating. Minister Fan looked at the woman in front of him and could not help but sigh. After the death of Fan Jian's first wife, Lady Lu had followed him. Back then, Fan Jian had been given the title of Count Sinan, but the emperor's favor was hidden in the shadows. Lady Lu was the granddaughter of the duke, and yet she had married him, a member of the Fan family. Who knew how many people in the capital were shocked? After their marriage, Lady Lu took good care of him, caring for him, and forcibly pulled him back from Lujing River. So no matter how you looked at it, he had a feeling for Lady Lu, and he felt sorry for her. Furthermore, the person being beaten in that study was his own son. Minister Fan was not young anymore. How could he not feel sorry for him? But no matter what he was thinking, he maintained a good expression on his face. He shook his head and scolded, Jade that is not polished is worthless. It is the fault of the father that the child is not taught. A loving mother spoils the child. At that moment, there was another cry from the study. It was Fantasia crying for his mother in pain. Fan Jian's eyebrows twitched and his heart twitched. He could no longer say the words of admonishment that he had been about to say. Lady Lu saw that her master had remained silent, and her tearful eyes showed her determination. She straightened her slightly disheveled dress and prepared to turn around and leave the study. Come back. Fan Jian scolded her in a low voice. Fan Xian is the eldest brother. It is only right for him to teach Cija a lesson. What will the child think if you run over now? What will the child think? Lady Lu turned around, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, you only think about what Fan Xian thinks, but not what I think. I only have one precious son. Do you have the heart to watch him be beaten to death? She bit her lower lip and cried hoarsely. That's right, I did make mistakes in the past, but after he came from Donjo, I tolerated everything and was careful and cautious, afraid that he would be unhappy. Based on what you said, I went around trying to bribe the nobles in the capital, afraid that I would drag the young master down. After all, his position in the capital is partly due to me. Of course, as a mother, it is natural for me to do these things, and I would not go to him to ask for credit. But what is happening now? How could he bear to be so heavy-handed? If he still remembers what happened back then, I'll just return this life to him. Don't touch my son. My son. Fan Jian looked at Lady Lu's sobbing appearance, and a wave of anger rose to his chest. He scolded, "What is this? Do you not know what kind of person Fan Xian is? Since he has let go of this matter, he will not pick it up again. Although he is young, he has a big heart. Xija went too far with what he did. If you don't teach him a lesson, he will drag the whole family down with him in the future. Will you be satisfied with that?" Lady Lu was not an ordinary woman, and now that she knew the Bayou brothel had been raided, she immediately knew that this had something to do with the struggle between the young master of the Fan family and the second prince. She wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes and said, "It was not a big deal. It was just that the second prince had a hold on it, and that is why Fan Xian is angry." This woman and her son had the same judgment about Fan Xian's anger. Fan Jian's face darkened, and he said, "Not a big deal. It's not like he didn't see the things that were sent to the study in the back. Xija is so young, and yet he is so ruthless. Although he did not do it himself, what difference does it make? Do you think your son has to do it himself for it to be a big deal?" Lady Lu couldn't help but speak up for her son, and she said, "Isn't there a lot of things like this in the capital? Who hasn't had this kind of trouble?" Before she could finish, Fan Jian cut her off and coldly said, "Don't talk about this anymore." Madame Lu obediently stopped talking, but the tear stains at the corners of her eyes had disappeared. Her eyes were still brimming with tears. The cries of pain and agony from the distant study gradually subsided. Instead, it made her, as his mother, even more frightened. Had you fainted or something? Fan Jian looked at her and couldn't help but sigh. He thought about what he had discussed with Fan Xian the night before, and his heart felt a little dark. In fact, over the past few months, Fan Xian had heard of Fan Xija's business in the capital, but he didn't care much about it. He thought it was a child's business, and what could he do? He didn't expect that, even as a father, he had underestimated Fan Xija's abilities and methods. Let Fan Xian handle it. Fan Jian comforted Lady Lu and said, "You should understand this. The more he doesn't try to avoid suspicion, the more it shows that he really sees Xija as his own brother. That child Fan Xian can even smile at his enemies. The reason why he is so tyrannical today is because he loves Xija. If it wasn't someone close to him, he would have just killed him. Why would he be so angry? Now that you understand this, you should be at ease. To tell you the truth, you know very well who our family can rely on in the future." Lady Lu understood this, of course. Fan Xian's reputation was too great, and they were riding a tiger. They could only go up but not down. Fan Jian was getting on in years. He might not leave this world, but there would come a day when he would retire. Whether it was Lady Lu or Xija, what kind of fortune they would have, and whether or not this manor would be safe for the rest of their lives, all depended on how the young master of the manor did in this country. But no matter what, Lady Lu would always feel some resentment towards Fan Xian. Fan Jian shook his head and motioned for her to follow him out of the study. They walked towards the study next to the garden in the back of the manor. Lady Lu was overjoyed and hurriedly followed. Even the servant girls behind her, who were holding hot towels, didn't care to discipline them and wave them away. Turning here and there, the servants could only watch as their master and mistress walked through the manor so quickly. They couldn't help but feel a little surprised, but then they thought of the pig being slaughtered that came from the front and back of the manor. They suddenly understood and began to feel uneasy. They thought that the young master had beaten the second young master so badly. If the master and mistress hurried over, wouldn't they start a fight? Things have been going smoothly for Fan Xian for the past few years, and the atmosphere in the manor had been very serious and lively. The servants had a strong sense of belonging, and they really didn't want anything to happen in the manor. Lady Lu hurried towards the garden with a face full of panic. She wanted to grow a pair of wings and fly over, but seeing her master's calm and broad back as usual, she didn't dare to be first. Just as she reached the entrance to the garden, which connected the front and back of the manor, she heard another wretched cry from the garden. The sound of countless wooden planks falling on flesh rang out, and it was a frightening sound. Lady Lu's mind was in a mess. Suddenly hearing this sound, she couldn't tell if it was her precious son who was crying. A wave of sadness rose up in her chest, and with a cry, she fainted. Fortunately, the servant girls behind her didn't dare to leave because of her rebuke. They followed behind her obediently, and only then were they able to support the trembling mistress. The quietest of the 3 study rooms was in a secluded place next to the rockery. It was where Fan Xian conducted his household affairs, and it had always been forbidden for servants to approach. At this moment, there were 3 people sitting in the study. Sitting behind the desk was Sir Yin Jr., who had just been appointed to the 4th Bureau, Yin Bingyan. Sitting to his right was Fan Xian's student, Shi Changli, and the bookkeeper of the 1st Bureau, Mu Tai. Aside from Tung Zijing and Deng Ziyu, who were supervising the execution in the garden, these 3 were Fan Xian's confidants. Yin Bingyun's position was naturally the most special. He was Fan Xian's superior, and they had a faint friendship. At this moment, he frowned as he listened to the clattering of the wooden planks in the garden. He couldn't help but shake his head. Something that should be sent to the capital government should not be punished at home. It is against the law of the Qing kingdom. It is against the law of the Qing kingdom. Among the 3 of them, only he dared to question Fan Xian's decision. Shi Changli laughed and explained to Sir Yin Jr., "We can't make a big deal out of this right now. If we really do send this to the capital government, and they find out that the 2nd young master and the one in the palace, there will be no turning back. The commissioner will have to fight the 2nd prince. But regardless of whether he wins or loses, the 2nd young master of the Fan family will not have a good ending. Based on the evidence that the capital government has, even if they don't sentence him to death, they will at least send him 3,000 miles south." Mu Tai smiled awkwardly, not daring to respond. After all, he was the one who had warned Fan Xian about the Bayou brothel. In other words, he was the one who had caused the 2nd young master of the Fan family to end up like this. Although Fan Xian was very pleased with his performance, who knew what the majority of the Fan family thought? Yin Bingyan shook his head again. It was clear that he didn't approve of Fan Xian's decision to use the family law to replace the national law. But he also knew that this was the only thing he could do. He couldn't help but mock him and say, "This commissioner of ours, he really is a man with a crystal heart. Even if the Bayou brothel case comes to light in the future, he will have something to say in front of the emperor. At least if the 2nd prince wants to investigate the Fan family for not being strict enough and allowing his brother to commit murder, it will be impossible." Shi Changli was shocked to hear this. He knew that Fan Xian had made this punishment known to the entire manor in order to get the news out and shut the mouths of the imperial censors. But Fan Xizha had committed a crime, and this was not going to work. Yin Bingyun smiled and looked at him, knowing what he was worried about. He said, "Don't worry about it. Your teacher has already made arrangements." Shi Changli thought to himself that this matter had nothing to do with the 4th Bureau. If Fan Xian was summoned here, then he must have made some sort of arrangement. But it wasn't convenient for him to continue asking. Mu Tai walked to the window and looked at the garden from afar. His buttocks were shaking, and his flesh was split open, and blood was spilled. Even though he was an official of the Overwatch Council, he couldn't help but be shocked by Fan Xian's ruthlessness. Seeing the children of the Fan and Lu families suffering under the punishment, he couldn't help but touch his own buttocks. Shi Changli once again busied himself with copying some documents that he was about to use. Lady Lu woke up and was about to fight Fan Xian to the death. She rubbed her eyes and realized that the people being beaten in the garden were her good-for-nothing relatives. Although the punishment was cruel and blood was splashing high into the air, and the children were crying out in pain. As long as it wasn't her own children suffering, Lady Lu had no objections. She returned to her noble and dignified demeanor as Lady Fan and looked at the scene coldly. In the woman's heart, her son Fan Sijia was capable of causing trouble on a small scale, but he had stirred up so many scandals in the capital. It was obvious that he had been seduced by evil spirits. The children and nephews of her maternal family, the members of the Fan clan, were naturally the main culprits. The more she watched, the angrier she became. Ignoring the cries for help from her maternal relatives, she gritted her teeth and yelled at Tung Zijing's bodyguards. The young master told you to hit them, so hit them hard. If you don't cure these little bastards, how can you vent your anger? As they spoke, the couple entered the study. As soon as they saw Fan Sijia lying on the bench in the corner of the room, his lower body naked, Madame Lu immediately panicked and threw herself at him. She looked at the bloody marks on her son's back and buttocks with heartache. She couldn't help but quietly cry. Her fingers carefully stroked the swollen bruises from the rod. "My son." A hand reached out with a handkerchief to wipe away the tears on her face. Lady Lu looked and saw that it was Fan Xian. She gritted her teeth. She didn't show any resentment, but she still couldn't help but feel a hidden bitterness. Fan Xian had already regained his composure. After the vicious beating, his anger had been mostly vented. He comforted her. "It's nothing. Step aside. I'll apply medicine for my brother." Lady Lu reluctantly stepped aside and watched as Fan Xian applied the medicine to Fan Sijia's body. By this time, Fan Sijia was out of breath from the beating. He was on the verge of death and could faint at any moment. Fan Jian looked to the side. His daughter-in-law and daughter were standing obediently in the corner. Er's eyes were filled with fear. The beating that had just taken place must have been frightening. Ruruo's eyes were filled with tears, not because of the pain her brother had suffered, but because of her brother's incompetence. He shook his head and coughed. Drawing everyone's attention, he asked Fan Xian evenly, "How are the arrangements?" "According to your wishes, Sijia will leave tonight," Fan Xian said respectfully. "It has already been arranged." Chapter 294. The conversation between the father and son continued, as if no one else was present. The three women who were listening were dumbfounded. Was it not enough to beat Fan Sijia to such a state? Was he going to be exiled from the capital? "Master, what did you say?" Lu Shi's eyes were wide with fear, and she looked at her master helplessly. Fan Sijia, who had been lying on the bench, had already leapt up from it. She did not know how he could still be so strong, given his injuries. It looked as if being exiled from the capital was a terrifying thing for all the nobles in the capital. Fan Sijia's but was in the air, and he was hugging his mother's legs. He squeezed his eyes, and a few drops of tears rolled down his cheeks, competing with the pockmarks on his face. His mouth was wide open, but before he could say anything, he had been hit so hard that he lost his voice. He anxiously opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The young man's tears were bright, and he shook his head furiously, unable to speak. His back was covered in blood, and he looked very pitiful. "Master!" Lu Shi couldn't take it anymore, and she looked at Fan Xian with resentment. She was like a tree that had been cut in half, and she knelt in front of Fan Xian. She cried and begged, "No, you can't. He is your precious son. Can you bear to see him be kicked out of the house? Can you bear to see him wander in a foreign country without any family?" She quickly grabbed Fan Ruo's hand and said, "Ruruo, quick, ask your father for mercy. Don't kick Sijia out of the house." Lu Shi thought that using the incident at the Baoyu house to kick Fan Sijia out of the house must have been Fan Xian talking behind their backs. Last night, the father and son had talked for a long time, so she quickly pulled Ruo into the fray. She thought that although Ruo was not her own daughter, they had lived together for over 10 years. She loved Fan Sijia, and everyone knew that Fan Xian loved his sister the most. Fan Ruo did not expect her brother to receive such a heavy punishment. She was pulled by Lu Shi, and she knelt down. Her voice trembled as she said, "Father, My brother has been taught a lesson. He will not do it again. Please forgive him this time. One stood by the side alone. Her heart was slightly flustered, and she hurriedly knelt down. Fan Jian remained calm until his daughter-in-law, who had a special status, knelt down as well. Only then did he help her up. He frowned at Lady Lu and said, "Xia must go, and don't blame Fan Xian. This is what I want." Madame Lu looked at him in disbelief, wondering why he was doing this. However, she knew very well that Fan Jian was a man with a gentle and upright appearance, but in reality, he had the air of a great general and a murderous aura. Otherwise, she wouldn't have fallen in love with him at first sight and refused to marry him. Since this was his idea, he would definitely not change it. She was a shrewd woman. Biting her lip, she turned around and bowed to Fan Xian. Weakly, she pleaded, "Young master, please say something to persuade the master." At this moment, the only person who could make Fan Jian withdraw his intention of exiling Fan Xia was Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not want to accept her bow, and he quickly avoided it. With a bitter smile, he looked at his father, asking for his opinion. Fan Jian coldly shook his head and said, "His crime today, if the imperial censor were to report it to the court, he would be exiled for 3,000 miles. I will kick him out of the capital, and that will be better than the court taking action." Madame Lu did not believe this. With Fan Xian's current power and influence, even if Fan Xian were to open a brothel and kill a few prostitutes, as long as it was not a crime of treason, Fan Jian and Fan Xian would be able to suppress it. She could not help but cry. "Master, how could you be so cruel? Xia, he is only 14. If I am not cruel, then this would happen." Fan Jian coldly laughed at himself. 14? Don't forget, when Fan Xian was 12 years old, he was already forced to kill, he yelled harshly. As soon as he said this, the entire room was silent. Lin Wan and Fan Ro, who did not know about this, looked at Fan Xian in shock. Madame Lu, who had always been tied down by this matter, was frightened and lowered her head in despair. Fan Xian laughed awkwardly. He knew that it was not convenient for him to say anything more. He carefully picked up Xia, who was covered in wounds, and retreated to a corner. He then ordered his wife and sister to carry his brother into the bedroom so that he could rest. "Fan Xian, come back later." Fan Jian looked at Madame Lu and walked out of the study. Only Madame Lu and Fan Xian were left in the study, and the atmosphere was a little awkward. After a while, Madame Lu opened her eyes and said, "Are you really going to kick him out of the capital?" Fan Xian sighed and walked closer to her. He lowered his voice and comforted her. "Do not worry. Father only wants Xia to leave the capital for a while. He wants to train outside." Before he could finish, Madame Lu suddenly asked, "How far will he go?" "Very far." Fan Xian looked at the absent-minded Madame Lu and thought that such a shrewd woman was worried about her son. He was suddenly confused, and for a moment, he envied Fan Xia. He missed someone. "How far?" Madame Lu asked in a shrill voice. Fan Xian did not care about her attitude at this time. He said calmly, "Father decided it last night. I wanted to persuade him to send Xia to Danzhou to hide, but he was worried that grandmother would not be able to do it. So he changed it to Northern Qi." Northern Qi? Madame Lu felt a little more at ease. Although Northern Qi was far away, it was not like the southern barbarians or the western barbarians that the court had exiled. It was much more prosperous and safe. Although Northern Qi and Qing did not get along, after the peace treaty, the two countries were currently in a honeymoon period, and their relationship was excellent. Fan Xian looked at Madame Lu's pleading eyes and knew what she was thinking. He comforted her, "Do not worry. I have many friends in Northern Qi. I will take good care of him." The moon peeked out from the other side of the autumn tree. Compared to the bright lights of Fan Manor, it was much dimmer. The sons and nephews of the Fan and Lu families, who had been beaten up in the garden, were taken away by carriages from Shangshu Alley and other places. When the relatives of the Fan family saw the wretched state of their sons, they felt pain in their hearts. Their gazes toward Fan Manor were filled with a bit of hatred. But because of the power of the Fan family, no one dared to curse. In the study, Fan Xian was standing next to his father, mixing fruit berries for him. That night, Madame Lu stayed by Fan Xija's bedside and did not leave his side. The fruit berries that Minister Fan drank every night had to be seasoned by Fan Xian himself. The 3 people I mentioned to father have already been sent to the capital government. The 3 people he mentioned were all people who had committed murder in the Bayou brothel. He looked at his father and spoke with concern. The capital government is under the second son's control. I don't think they expected us to send them to the capital government. But those 3 people have been involved in murder cases, which means they're important people who want to take down Fan Xija. I think they will be picked up by the second son's people tonight. Fan Jian laughed and said, "Don't hide it from me. I know you won't be so careless. I will take care of it." Fan Xian laughed as well. This time, he had finally used all of the power Chun Pingping had given him, and he had mobilized the assassins of the 6th Bureau. They committed a crime punishable by death, but I think there will be repercussions from within the family. I will need you to make an appearance. Fan Jian knew what he was worried about. In the capital, there had never been an official who would harm a member of their own family. He shook his head and said, "What is there to make an appearance for? We have sent them to the capital government. What does that have to do with us?" Fan Xian heard this and was impressed. After thinking for a while, he said, "Xija, we will leave tonight. I will let Yin Bingyan take care of this. There shouldn't be any traces left behind." Fan Jian nodded and said, "I have nothing to do with the people of Northern Qi. Back in the day, I killed too many of them. Are you sure you can handle this?" Fan Xian met his father's gaze and knew that he was worried about Fan Xija's safety. He nodded solemnly and said, "Wang Qinian is now in Shangjing, and I have a good relationship with Haidang and the Emperor of Northern Qi. Xija should be fine in Shangjing." Fan Jian sighed, and the white frost on his mane was particularly eye-catching tonight. He said, "You used to tell me that Xija was talented and that he didn't have to study to become an official. I listened to you, but I didn't think this child would be more radical than you, and I thought. He started doing this at the age of 14. What was I doing when I was 14? I was still studying with the crown prince in King Cheng's manor, now the emperor. All I thought about was how to have fun." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "Igui Pin's 3rd son is really something. He became the owner of a brothel at the age of 8. If this gets out, it will be recorded in the annals of Qing history. His name will go down in history. As for Igui Pin, I will talk to her." Fan Jian shook his head. Although Xija is talented, he is still too superficial. Going down the path of evil is not a long-term solution. This time, I will take this opportunity to let him go out and see the world. First, I will punish him, and second, I hope that he will be able to become a useful person. Fan Xian sighed and said, "I have my own problems. Don't blame yourself." Fan Jian waved his hand and had him sit down. "When it happened, you weren't in the capital, but I am curious. Why did you seem so at ease when I suggested sending Xija to Northern Qi? You should know that Northern Qi does not treat the people of Qing well." Fan Xian did not speak of the wordless agreement he had made with Haidang and the young emperor, but he did explain his thoughts. He smiled and said, "Xinjiang has been using the Cui family to smuggle goods into Northern Qi. Now that Shenzhong is dead, there have been some problems with their routes. I think that if Xija can be trained in the north in a few years, perhaps he will have the opportunity to take over the Cui family's business. After all, he likes it. Since he wants to do business, I want to arrange a bigger business for him to do." Fan Jian smiled and looked at his son with satisfaction. Fan Xian's thoughts could be considered meticulous. Compared to Fan Jian and Chun Pingping's generation, he was only a little less ruthless. "When do you plan to move against the Cui family?" Seeing his father so easily point out his plan, Fan Xian did not feel the slightest bit uneasy. He smiled and said, "It will be after I take over the palace treasury, around March or April next year." Fan Jian nodded and suddenly said with a gloomy face, "Don't give them any chance to retaliate. This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his father's honest and kind face reveal a ruthless side. His heart trembled, and he responded in a low voice. Fan Jian continued to speak in a cold voice. You have handled this matter well. Temporary tolerance can buy you time to react. After Xia leaves, do what you want to do. Don't ask for my opinion. But there is someone, Yuan Meng. Is that her name? Fan Jian suddenly said. She does things shrewdly, and her style is sinister. In a few days, when this matter has died down, you can get rid of her. That will be the end of those cases. Fan Xian was shocked. He did not know if his father had killed Yuan Meng to avenge Xia, or if it was for some other reason. Fan Jian's next words revealed this minister's deepest humanism and his long-hidden spirit of universal love. He said coldly, I grew up in Lu Jing River, and I have always cherished flowers. What I hate the most are those who destroy them. Furthermore, this Yuan Meng was a woman from a brothel, and yet she was willing to lay her hands on a weak woman of the same profession. I cannot allow such a person to exist in this world. Fan Xian suddenly understood. He remembered that King Jing often teased him, and remembered that his father used to be a brothel guest. Those stories of his love affairs were still being spread throughout the capital. Seeing the tragic deaths of the prostitutes in the case file had touched his sensitive spot. No wonder he could not tolerate Yuan Meng. He took the opportunity to say, Yuan Meng is Hongqing's. Do you think about Hongqing and his sister's marriage? Without waiting for him to finish, Fan Jian shook his head and said, Hongqing is a good child. Let's keep an eye on him for a few more days. After all, this is a marriage arranged by the emperor. We need to be careful. Fan Xian was disappointed, and he was angry that his father did not care about Ruo's happiness. He wondered if Ruo was not as good as the women in the brothel. Fan Xian made up his mind. Even without his father's help, he was going to continue. He left the study room and entered it again. The three people in the study room saw him enter, and they all stood up to greet him. Shi Chanli handed over a document with dried ink and said, This is the agreement for the transfer of 70% of the shares of the Baoyu House. Please take a look, and then the second master will sign it. Mu Tai continued, The capital government has been keeping an eye on us. According to the information sent back by our spies, the capital government is troubled by the murder suspects we sent to them. Later, a servant from the second prince's side went to the capital government's manor. We don't know what they discussed. Fan Xian nodded and said, It doesn't matter. We won't be doing anything for the next few days. Mu Tai frowned and said, What if they misjudge the situation and think we're going to fight to the death? What if they send the capital government to arrest the second master? Fan Xian looked at Yin Bingyun, who had been silent this entire time. He shook his head and said, With the boss of the 4th Bureau here, if Fan Xia goes north, who will be able to find him? You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.